You ready? Thank you. The committee will come to order. Before I begin, and I don't think that I have to remind the audience broadly, but I will, decorum will be maintained here so that our two witnesses, both seated governors, are heard without any unreasonable interruption. If you agree with them, smile. If you disagree with them, smile. The fact is that this is about America hearing from two governors who have a high responsibility to serve their states, and we have a high responsibility to hear them. The Chair cannot allow any disruptions, and I appreciate that all those who came to get a message out did so before the gavel, and I appreciate that if you'd like to remain, you can remain for the entire hearing. We are open to the public, but if there's any disruption, your seats will go to the people waiting outside who also would like to be in attendance. This committee has a long-standing history of doing that on a bipartisan basis. I now recognize the ranking member for unanimous consent.
I ask unanimous consent. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Unanimous consent that Representative Gwen Moore of the 4th District of Wisconsin be permitted to attend in this hearing pursuant to Rule 11, Section 2G2C, and ask questions of the witnesses.
Per our rule, without objection, so ordered. The Oversight Committee's mission statement is that we exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the government oversight and the government oversight reform, on the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, it's only my committee, is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We will work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people, bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the mission of Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Today's hearing continues the committee's effort to examine crises brought on by out-of-control spending and mounting debt at the State level. And let me assure you, that is not to say every State is out of control, but virtually every State in the Union and many localities have increased their debt load at a time in which debt service is at an all-time low. The American people are well aware of the fiscal crisis Washington faces on a national level. They are ready for Congress to cut spending, and even President Obama has lauded recent spending cuts championed by the House Republicans. What is less known is that the severe fiscal problems that some of our States and municipal governments face. Already this year, our Financial Services Subcommittee, under the leadership of Chairman Patrick McHenry, has done a great service by highlighting problems created by some irresponsible spending. I thank Chairman McHenry for his efforts. The facts we have learned from the subcommittee are telling. Currently, States face a combined budget shortfall of roughly $112 billion for fiscal year 2012, an amount equal to approximately 1/5 of their budgets. That, if nothing is done, will pile on more debt for the future. The evidence why this has occurred is clear. Since 1990, State and local government spending has increased 70% faster than inflation. When the recession hit, State and local tax revenues simply no longer sustained that growth. Looming just around the corner, unfunded or underfunded pension liabilities pose a daunting threat to State and municipal budgets. This burdens taxpayers with an estimated $3 trillion in debt. I say estimated because nobody knows the full exposure that taxpayers have due the fact that The bond markets are not transparent, and the reporting rules do not force adequate disclosure. Additionally, as we have seen here, when we have talked about the correct amounts to be withheld for our postal carriers, we find that there is up to $5.5 billion of up to $6.5 trillion, up to this is not on the script, folks, so bear with me, up to $6.5 billion of discrepancy between two opposing sides on this issue. Indeed, over the past 20 years, State and local governments have promised to government workers that they knew they could not keep in some cases, hoping that future wealth would continue to propel them. Today we have two governors with us, and we are pleased to welcome Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker and Vermont Governor Peter Shumlin. They come from two very different states, one larger, one smaller, one in the midst of a tough downturn that may in fact continue for a very long time as many of the core industries that have created wealth begin to change, and that transition may be long and painful. Vermont, on the other hand, a wonderful state filled with a great deal of industry that may be facing challenges today, but are likely to be slightly less systemic than what Wisconsin faces. This doesn't change the fact that both governors are dealing with the issues of shortfalls in their own way, and today we look forward to hearing how they are going to retain the viability of their state long after their terms have ended. Unionized Federal workers don't even have collective bargaining rights. Governor Walker's bold reforms seem reasonable to those of us in Washington who understand that our retirement and health care system at the Federal level is not subject to collective bargaining, that in fact it is based on a single system, uniform throughout the Federal workforce, and not debatable as to withholding or as to the benefits. That's not to say that Federal workers don't have a good program. They do. But their program has been based on a long list of requests considered by Congress and funded. So as we deal with Federal issues, hopefully we deal with State issues who in many cases have less room to maneuver, are looking for more room to maneuver, and believe that they can achieve it through changes in their laws. Lastly, the insolvency of Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, most often called the pigs, tells us that States within a greater union can in fact be a challenge for the Union. The independent countries of Europe that belong to the European Union are more loosely configured than our own States. That means that if we have insolvency in 3, 4, 5 of our States, we have a greater challenge to our common nation than does the European Union. And yet, the European Union has been constantly trying to figure out ways to maintain these States within the European Union, help them bail themselves out, and, in fact, insist that they change policies that have gotten into this problem. We are not here today to intervene in the sovereign States that are before us. We are here to understand what they are doing in self-help. With that, I recognize the Ranking Member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that the statement of the National Education Associated dated April 14, 2011 be admitted into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I strongly support efforts to help States continue their economic recovery and eliminate the budget shortfalls caused by the most severe financial crisis since the Great Depression. Many States have been forced to make significant cuts in their budgets, trimming critical programs that help our nation's veterans, assist the developmentally disabled, supply health care services to the poor, and provide nursing home services to our seniors. These are difficult decisions, and I have great respect for governors who are able to work with governmental and non-governmental entities to develop innovative ways to preserve as many services as possible for their citizens while making fiscally responsible choices. However, I strongly oppose efforts to falsely blame middle-class American workers for these current economic problems. We know better than anybody else in this committee why those problems came about. This recession was not caused by them. Working America, firefighters, teachers, and nurses, and so many others, who are, in the words of the theologian Swindoll, are so often unseen, unnoticed, unappreciated, and unapplauded, are not responsible for the reckless actions of Wall Street, which led to this crisis in the first place. I also strongly object to efforts by politicians who try to use current economic downturn to strip American workers of their rights. Mr. Chairman, we are a country who has consistently increased rights, not taken them away. As a matter of fact, if it were not for that principle, I would not be sitting here today, and the women in this Congress would not be sitting here today. The right to negotiate working conditions that are safe, the right to negotiate due process protections against being fired arbitrarily, and the right to negotiate fair pay for an honest day's work. Today's hearing is a study in contrast. We are very fortunate to have with us two state governors, Governor Shumlin from Vermont and Governor Walker from Wisconsin, and we are glad to have them. Both face budget shortfalls this year, but they approach the rights of workers in drastically different ways. Governor Shumlin of Vermont faced a budget shortfall, ladies and gentlemen, of about $176 million for fiscal year 2012. He negotiated with state employees who accepted a 2-year, 3% pay cut. Vermont teachers also agreed to work 3 additional years before retiring and to contribute more towards their pensions. And the Vermont State Employees Association voted to increase their pension contribution by 1.3% over the next 5 years. In addition to obtaining these concessions, Governor Shumlin also did something else. He proposed spreading additional cuts across various state agencies, as well as raising additional revenue through select surcharges and assessments. In other words, he developed a plan to spread out and share sacrifices across the state. And we should note that those employees went along with it because they, too, wanted to strengthen their own state's fiscal situation. Governor Walker took a very different approach in Wisconsin. He faced a projected shortfall of $137 million in the current fiscal year. Within days of the governor's announcing a budget proposal to address this shortfall, labor leaders in Wisconsin agreed to accept all of his financial demands. They agreed to increase their pension contributions more than 20-fold, and they agreed to double their share of the health insurance premiums. But Governor Walker did not accept these concessions. Instead, he went much further by attempting to strip government employees of their collective bargaining rights. He demanded numerous provisions that had nothing to do with the state's budget and had no fiscal impact. For example, he wanted to require unions to hold annual votes to continue representing their members, and he wanted to prevent employees from paying union dues through their paychecks. Governor Walker refused to meet with union leaders, and he declared publicly that he would not negotiate with them. One of the big questions we will have of Governor Walker today is why did he not say yes to the unions when they agreed to meet all of his financial demands? And on a broader level, what is motivating this extreme effort to dismantle the unions themselves? In my opinion, it is shameful to play politics with American workers and their families. These are real people, middle-class Americans who are trying to put food on their table for their family, keep a roof over their heads, educate their children, and plan for retirement that does not burden their loved ones. We should be helping these workers, not attacking them, because they are the engine and the author of the American recovery. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman, Subcommittee Chairman Patrick McHenry, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for holding this hearing today. And Governors, thank you for being here. Over the past 2 months, Congressman Quigley, who is a ranking member of my subcommittee, we've held hearings on state budgets and pensions and their impact on the municipal bond market. 2 essential questions immediately stood out. First, what is the true debt burden facing our states and municipalities? And second, what must be done to mitigate the immediate crisis and put all forms of government back on a solvent fiscal trajectory? After holding hearings with scholars, state senators, rating agencies, and other parties about state budgets and pensions, we confirmed what leading economists are predicting. and what we will hear from the testimony today, that 2012 will be one of the most difficult budget years for states and municipalities on record. 44 states in the District of Columbia are now projecting aggregate budget shortfalls totaling $112 billion for this year alone, and it only gets worse from here on out. If that wasn't enough, there are unfunded pension liabilities upwards of $3.2 trillion for states and $383 billion for local governments, some of which is kept off of states' accounting books, representing trillions of dollars in shadow accounting. Today, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will use the words like extreme, tax increases, and use those words repeatedly to describe what is either happening in terms of cuts or what is necessary to get out of this situation. We are not facing a revenue problem. It is a spending problem. But as always, the numbers don't lie. Since 1990, state and local governments have increased spending by roughly 70% faster than inflation. In addition to this unchecked, reckless spending, the looming burden of paying out trillions of dollars in lucrative public pensions and health care benefits leaves state and local governments in dire straits. I have stated before that there will be severe consequences if we are dishonest about the fiscal obligations before us and refuse to change course. The cost of inaction will be borne by the young teachers who are told that their cash-strapped school districts can no longer afford their retirement benefits because it must finance the exorbitant benefits of others. Many public servants, like firefighters and policemen, faced with the possibility that their vital jobs that they hold will no longer provide a standard of living for their families, will simply choose another career. In the end, the people that we count on to teach our children and to protect our homes and our families will realize that their government has failed them and actively hurt their retirement security. We have an opportunity to change that. Numerous states have seen the writing on the wall and decided to take action. In recent years, at least 15 states passed legislation to reform some aspect of their pension system. For example, Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana successfully reformed collective bargaining, leading to more efficient and effective government. Governor Walker has boldly set out to push through similar initiatives in Wisconsin. We have seen this in the national news. Even in the face of extremely heated political attacks, Governor Walker has shown that he understands and has a genuine commitment to reform and to prevent this fiscal calamity. The Governor's proposals were recently welcomed by the bond market and Moody's, which said that Governor Walker's plan will have a positive effect on the credit rating of his state. In the end, that will mean less cost and less expense to his taxpayers in order to get lending. Change is never easy, but if we wish to ensure an honest retirement for those who teach our children or protect our families and leave the next generation a country as economically vibrant as the one that we inherited, we must be serious about the problems we face. It is our responsibility to be fair to our current retirees and honor our commitment to them, while at the same time not punishing the next generation of America for today's free spending ways. It's only possible if we take the necessary steps before it's too late. It's not too late. We still have the opportunity for change, and that's what this discussion here today is about. Moreover, in light of the hearings that we've had and the discussion we'll hear today, I think it's important that taxpayers and the market generally have the transparency necessary to understand the fiscal situation states are in. Taxpayers deserve it. Those that are paying into the pensions deserve it. And the American people broadly deserve that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thank you for your leadership. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I thank him for what his subcommittee on a bipartisan basis has been doing on this matter. We now recognize his partner, the ranking member of the subcommittee on TARP, Financial Services and Bailouts of Public and Private Programs, Mr. Quigley, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank you for convening today's third hearing on state municipal debt. I would like to thank the Chairman of the subcommittee for his efforts in those first two committee meetings. I would also like to thank our 6 witnesses for contributing their time and expertise today. Let me begin by saying, in the end, I do think we have a revenue problem, and the revenue problem at the local level was because of the economic downturn. It shrunk local government's revenues dramatically, as cities and states are like. So it was a revenue problem. Now, that doesn't mean that you should raise taxes, because I understand where you are coming from, but raising taxes during a recession is a bad idea. But we have to recognize that in the end, this was in large part a revenue problem. So having addressed that, the other things we have learned in these hearings is that many states have these big challenges. And you don't have to tell me, I come from Illinois. Illinois failed to heed the Old Testament story that advised that one should save during the 7 good years to survive during the 7 lean years. While Illinois' current administration didn't dig the hole that it got, it has to move forward on substantive fiscal reform. Illinois and other states in similar situations owe it to their taxpayers to fix their budget. If states like Illinois and New Jersey and California don't get serious about reform, they will never be able to keep the basic promises they have made. Reform should be emphasizing reinventing, streamlining government, and adapting to changing times. But reform should not demonize public sector workers who have dedicated their careers to government service. While states have the right to make their own policy, I strongly support collective bargaining rights for public sector workers, but recognize that we have to work together collectively to solve these problems. Collective bargaining rights didn't cause the recession, and curtailing them won't fix state budget deficits. What will fix state budget deficits are common-sense reforms that restore budgets to a sustainable path. Consider public sector collective bargaining facts and figures. A simple calculation shows that states that allow public sector collective bargaining have an average projected 2012 deficit of 14% relative to their budgets. 14% is big, but states that forbid public sector collective bargaining have projected deficits at 16.5%. Either way you spin it, ending collective bargaining rights won't reduce budget deficits. Workers have to play a role to meet these fiscal realities. It is obvious we have to reduce deficits and long-term debt, but we shouldn't take advantage of the economic downturn to achieve long-standing ideological goals. Public sector should continue to have collective bargaining rights, and we need to work together to achieve responsible reform. Soon I will be releasing Part 2 of a series of reports on reinventing our Federal budget. This reform will recommend over $1 trillion in savings over the next 10 years. This report builds on Part 1 I released in November, but also on a series of reports I released as a Cook County Commissioner. I bring this up because I remember how frustrating it was to try to achieve substantive reform at the local level. The truth is these same frustrations are present here in Washington, but we can't let those frustrations get the better of us. States like Illinois need fiscal reform. We need to streamline, consolidate, and reinvent government, not because it's unimportant, but because its mission is so important. It's where the wheels hit the street. And if we can remember, the true heroes of 9/11 were civil service workers. That's why we should restore these local governments to sustainability rather than tear them down. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The Chair will have members may have 7 legislative days in order to submit additional statements and extraneous material. We would now like to recognize our first panel of witnesses. No one on this side of the dais currently can introduce them as well as their own members. So with that, I would call on Chairman Jim Sensenbrenner to introduce his governor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure and honor today to introduce my friend and constituent, Governor Scott Walker. I first got acquainted with Scott about 20 years ago when he was starting to get active in Republican politics. He was elected 17 years ago to the State Assembly, and in 2002, he won a recall election for Chief Executive or County Executive of Milwaukee County. He was reelected to 2 full terms as a Republican in one of the most Democratic counties in the country. And his political success has been based upon the fact that he tells people where he stands and, once elected, implements them. He faced some very tough times in Milwaukee County as a result of an outrageous pension scandal that his predecessor was at the heart of. He was able to pass 9 county budgets or propose 9 county budgets without a tax increase, and this background allowed him to be elected as the 45th Governor of Wisconsin last fall. Very few people here, I think, knew who Scott Walker was until the last 2 months or so. However, those of us who have known Scott Walker and his commitment to principle were really not surprised at the proposals that he made to close not a $137 million budget deficit, but a $3.6 billion budget deficit through the end of the next budget period. So again, I am sure that you will find Governor Walker as interesting as we in Wisconsin have. He's a very polarizing figure, but those of us who love him in Wisconsin really thank him for the job that he's done.
I thank the gentleman. And with all the people that Governor Shumlin could have had introduce him, he chose Peter Welch. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the committee that I proudly serve on. It's my pleasure to introduce Governor Peter Shumlin of Vermont. First of all, a couple of things about Peter. He's a private sector person. He and his brother established and expanded a very successful private business, Putney Student Travel, in southern Vermont. He's been on the front line of creating jobs, of having to pay good wages and good benefits and deal with the practical realities of keeping a business going day in and day out, expanding it, growing it, and being an employer. He also served in our citizen legislature in Vermont for many years, first in the House of Representatives and then for several terms in the State Senate. And Peter, as the President pro tem of the State Senate, that's our Senate leader, served more years as Senate President than any other Vermonter in history, and that's 10 years. So he comes to his job with legislative experience, with private sector experience, with the obligation to pay bills and make the trains run on time. He is now serving as Governor of Vermont after being elected in this past election. Just to give you a sense of how Vermont operates, he won a primary with 4 other Democrats, and there was a recount because his original margin of victory was about 200 votes. During the recount, Peter and the 4 other candidates rented a van, and while we were awaiting the outcome of who won, went on a unity tour around the state of Vermont, talking together rather than fighting each other during the recount. Every single member of 5 excellent candidates all said, we trust our town clerks, and just let them do the count and we'll accept the result. He also comes to the job with the benefit of a tremendous history that we in Vermont are proud of, a bipartisan tradition. And it embraces really 2 things. Number one, we fight hard in Vermont, Republicans and Democrats, just like we do here. But in Vermont, Democrats think that Republicans usually have a merit to their argument, and Republicans think Democrats have something to say. And we actually do our best to listen to each other because both sides have enough humility to appreciate that, in fact, there's truth on both sides, and we've got to come together for the good of the state. And just a little bit of background, we had a Governor Snelling, Richard Snelling, very respected and revered. We had a downturn in the 80s. He did something with a Democratic Speaker of the House to try to adjust the fiscal situation, because we pay our bills. We don't, in Vermont, have a balanced budget amendment, but we're cheap, and we pay our bills. We're frugal. The Democrats agreed to cut programs that were really important to them. The Governor agreed to a temporary surtax because we needed some revenues. It worked out. We came into balance. The taxes went down, and we were able to support our programs. We then had Governor Dean in good times. He cut taxes. He's a Democrat. And when he did that, he implemented some tough budget reforms to make sure we didn't spend just because we had a surplus. We sent money back to the taxpayer, and we put into place budget controls. Peter Shumlin is carrying on that tradition. When we got into a fiscal situation, Governor Douglas, his predecessor, Republican, worked with the unions and said, hey, we've got to share the sacrifice here. They negotiated pay cuts. They started looking at benefits. They sat down at the table and worked it out. And there was a sense of common purpose shared sacrifice. And that's the second approach that's been embodied in Vermont. If there's pain that has to be sustained, we have to share that pain together. And what it's done is helped us make progress even in tough times. Peter, just to give you an idea, as Senate President, when we had a large Democratic majority, he did something that you'd get you'd get mentally tested around here if you did it. He appointed Republicans to chair major committees. So in Vermont, the two principles are listen to each other, there's truth on both sides, and work together and share sacrifice when sacrifice is required. So it's my pleasure to introduce Governor Peter Shumlin of Vermont.
I thank the gentleman. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in. Would you please rise to take the oath and raise your right hand? Peter, you can stay seated. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. Gentlemen, we have congressmen who come before us, senators who come before us, and governors come before us. Governors are always the best witnesses. They understand that the 5 minutes allows for the Q&A, that in fact your entire testimony will be placed in the record. To help you with this, you will see the typical green, yellow, and red lights. As my predecessor on the committee said, in all 50 states, we know what red means. So with that, I recognize, we didn't do a coin flip, so who wants to go first? Governor Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, visiting members as well. Governor, it's good to be with you here as well. We got to know each other a little bit after the elections with the new training for new governors. It's an honor to be here today. As was mentioned by several in the testimony, we're not alone in Wisconsin. There's 44 different states in the District of Columbia that's facing deficits. In fact, in total, over $111 billion in total deficits, ranging from 2 to 45% of their budgets. In our case in Wisconsin, for the next biennial budget, which starts July 1, we face a $3.6 billion budget deficit. Now, governors across the country, Democrat and Republican alike, are facing that challenge. In many cases, the proposals we've seen from one end of the country to the other are governors cutting. In many cases, they're cutting billions of dollars from aid to local governments, school districts, and others. And in turn, what it's forcing in many of those states is one of two things, either massive layoffs or massive property tax increases. And in many cases, sadly, some of both. In Wisconsin, we have a different option, a progressive, in the best sense of the word, a progressive option. For us, we're giving state and local governments the tools they need, not just to balance the budget this year or for the next 2 years, but for generations to come. And that's important. Now, some here and other places around the country may say that's a bold political move, but I would argue it's a very modest request. What we're asking from government employees like myself is a 5.8% contribution for our pension and a 12.6% contribution for health care. That's protecting the middle class. That protects middle-class jobs and middle-class taxpayers. And if you ask middle-class workers in my state, they'll tell you they think what we're offering is pretty reasonable. I'll give you a good example. I don't have to go too far from that. My brother David works as a banquet manager, part-time as a bartender. His wife works for a department store. They have 2 beautiful kids. One just turned 4 the other day. They are a typical middle-class family. When this debate first started, he said to me, I pay some $800 a month for my health insurance premiums and the little bit I can set aside for my 401k. I'd love to have a deal. I would love to have a deal like what you're offering. I hear that all across my state. When I go to plants and factories and small businesses and farms, they say we'd love to have a deal like that because on average our middle-class taxpayers are paying about 20% of their health insurance premiums. In fact, you all know this with Federal employees. Federal employees pay on average 28% of their health insurance premiums. As the Chairman alluded to, Federal employees, for the most part, do not have collective bargaining rights for benefits and ultimately for salary. Makes me wonder why the protesters are in Madison and Columbus and not right here in Washington, D.C. You got to look at the facts. I mean, it's very clear out there. What we're offering is more generous than what you offer Federal government employees. And yet the outrage is not here. It's in our state capitals. More important, though, than just the fiscal impact, because what we're talking about here ultimately saves $1.7 billion in state and local government spending over the next 2 years in our biennial budget. It's not the only way we're balancing our budget, but it is a piece of that. The other important element to remember is this makes government work better. I can think no better example than a young woman by the name of Megan Sampson, who a year ago was named the Outstanding Teacher of the Year, a teacher in the Milwaukee Public School System at the time, and a week later she got a pink slip. She was one of the teachers laid off. Why? Because her collective bargaining agreement required a contract that protected a system that pays more than $100,000 in compensation, total compensation per teacher, with no contribution for health care, and ultimately has a system based on seniority. Our reforms allow schools and other local governments to hire and fire based on performance and merit, paying for performance so we put our best teachers and our best workers out front. That ultimately is going to make things work better. It worked in Indiana when Mitch Daniels did this 6 years ago. We've seen the government more efficient, more effective, more accountable to the public, and ultimately great workers were rewarded in that state and continue to be rewarded today. Finally, the last thing I would just tell you is this ultimately is good for the economy in our state as well, because in the end, investors want to look at a state where the state and local government is stable. We're showing that Wisconsin is open for business. And the thing, I guess, the most important point I'd bring up to you today is when you think about what we're doing, we're really making a commitment to the future. I've got 2 high school sons. In fact, some of their classmates are here today from Wauwatosa East High School. Our proposals are about making a commitment to the future so our children don't face even more dire consequences than what we face today. For more than 200 years, this country has been based on leadership, where leaders cared more about their children and their grandchildren than they did about themselves. It's time here in Wisconsin and across this country. We have leaders, again, who worry more about the next generation, the next election, and that's exactly what we're doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Governor. Governor Shumlin.
Thank you so much, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings. Thank you so much for this invitation today. To all members of the Oversight and Reform Committee, in particular thanks to my friend and Congressman Peter Welch, who does an extraordinary job for us down here in Washington. Thanks for that warm welcome. It's great to be here also with Governor Walker. As Governor Walker mentioned, we met at Baby Governor School out in Colorado. And I don't want to give you any ideas, any of you Congress people are running for governor, but if you do, you get to go to school. And we had a wonderful dinner together, Governor Walker, myself, and his wonderful wife. And we share common challenges. We are among the biggest class of new governors in the history of America. And we share a very challenging job. In fact, I said to Governor Walker earlier, I said, if they told us at Baby Governor School the message that we were taking over, we might have rethought it, but it was too late. But we are dealing with some really tough economic times, as you know. And to help make Governor Walker's trip to Washington more valuable, I brought a little bit of Vermont maple syrup down, Governor. And I just want to make clear that we're the #1 maple producer in the country. Governor Walker's #4, and our syrup, it doesn't come any better.
Governor, how did you get that through TSA?
You know, that's one of the advantages of being governor. The Governor Walker can tell you about. There's no more TSA, so that's how I brought the syrup down. But thank you. We are both facing the first 100 days. We have similar challenges, creating jobs and raising incomes of those that are earning less money in Vermont, or on average the same money as they were earning 10 years ago. That's both of our challenges in our respective states, and the other governors share it. Mr. Chair, I just want to directly address the question of what's causing this fiscal crisis that both Governor Walker and I find ourselves in. We know it's a result of the greatest recession in American history. The result for us is declining revenues and expanding expenses as we face higher unemployment rates, higher service costs, and the rest. That's the challenge. Now, without getting into how we got here, because I know that's been debated, and we'll save that debate for another day, I simply want to talk a little bit about what our challenge is as governors to create jobs, economic opportunities, and balance our budgets. And when I look at it, I don't start with collective bargaining, and I don't start with my public pensions. I start with the true costs. In Vermont, and this is true in most of the states of the country, health care is my biggest rising cost. I've watched health care costs in Vermont double over the last decade, from $2.5 billion to $5 billion a year. In 2015, my banking and insurance commissioner tells me Vermonters will be spending an additional $1.6 billion on health care, and that's the biggest cost in my state budget. Now, what's that mean in real dollars? It means $2,500 by 2015. That's $1.6 billion. $2,500 out of every Vermonter's pocket, from those that were born yesterday to those at the other end of life, in a state where, on average, our people are making the same wages they were making 10 years ago. So I'm going where the money is for both the state and the people of my state to grow jobs and economic opportunities. We're trying to get health care costs under control. The second driver, believe it or not, it's corrections. Our corrections budget has doubled in the last decade. Other governors are facing similar challenges. So we're trying to go where the money is. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about our experience with state pension and retiree health care obligations for state employees, because I think it really matters in this debate. What we've learned in this area is that there are steps that you can take to significantly reduce the cost to taxpayers without undermining traditional defined benefit plans, which most objective parties agree provide better retirement security, serve to retain quality employees, and are more efficient than a defined contribution plan. That's what we've learned. How did we get there, and how did we work together to get the job done? What we did, and I was then President of the Senate with a Republican governor and a Republican speaker, is we brought the unions together. And we understood that it was going to be an example of shared sacrifice, and so did our state employees, as Congressman Welch suggested. What did we get? In those discussions, the lesson we learned was that we get more with maple syrup than we do with vinegar. We brought them to the table, we talked it out, and here was the result: shared sacrifice. 3 to 5% pay cuts for all state employees, depending upon your range of salary, over a 2-year period with no step increases. 2, we got higher retirement contributions from our state employees. 3, we raised retirement ages for state employees to help us with the problem. 4, we reduced health care benefits to our state employees and some of our teachers. And 5, we required, what this resulted in was a 25% reduction in our annual payment to pension funds and still have them fully funded. So the point I'm simply trying to make is you can get this job done, you can balance your budget, you can create jobs in your state without taking on the basic right of collective bargaining. Now, the reason I feel so strongly about that is I ask the question, who got us into this mess, and how do we deal with it? I can tell you from my perspective as governor, we just came through the toughest winter in about 20 years. Lots of snow, lots of ice. Our plow trucks were out almost every day. We've eaten through our plowing budgets. I got to tell you, I went out with a plow truck, as I'm sure Governor Walker has done. We get out as governors. And when I got behind the windshield of that plow truck in a driving snowstorm, with my plow truck driver who was working 7 or 8 different levers with a 14-foot plow in front of that truck and a tractor-trailer truck passing him on the right and some yahoo on the left, I got to tell you, in a full whiteout, working a 12 or 14-hour day for about $14 an hour, that plow truck driver didn't get us into this mess. When I go and visit schools and I see the children, the challenges our kids are dealing with, they didn't get us into this mess. My public employees didn't get us here. We've asked them to share the sacrifice in getting us out, but it doesn't mean that we take away collective bargaining, which is what made the middle class in America strong and the folks that are under assault in this recession. So in closing, Mr. Chair, I'll simply say this. We have found, as I mentioned, that you can bring folks together around a table, compromise, get the job done, balance your budgets, create jobs, be fiscally responsible, but you don't have to take on the basic principle of collective bargaining. You don't take on your firefighters, you don't take on your police officers, you don't take on your teachers, and you don't take on your hardworking employees. You work together with them with maple syrup, not vinegar. It works. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. I'll now recognize myself for the first round of questions. Governor, the sign behind me, we don't normally point to the sign, it's just the title here today, but the last part where it says choice or necessity? The cuts you made in cooperation with your various union groups and public workers, because probably like most states, 80% of what you spend directly or indirectly on the people who work for the government. Was it a choice? Was it a necessity to, in fact, find a way to provide essential services for less money and not go into deficit spending?
It was a necessity. I mean, in the respect that while we don't have a balanced budget amendment, as Congressman Wells suggested, we have to balance our budgets to get the job done. And so we made the choices that we do in Vermont because we really like our AAA bond rating. I'm a business person. We want to be fiscally responsible. And we understand that we can't take care of the most vulnerable unless we balance our budgets.
Good. And I'd like to ask Governor Walker the same question. And we're rather in love with the title of today, so we thought we'd get that answer out.
Well, I think in a rhetorical sense it certainly is necessary. But we've seen in the past, in my state's history prior to us making these critical decisions right now, for many it was a choice. And the reason they failed to make the right choice is why we're here today. And that includes Democrats and Republicans before. For many, many years, lawmakers and governors in our state failed to make the right choice, deferred tough decisions to the future. They raided segregated funds. They delayed payments. They used one-time Federal stimulus aid 2 years ago to balance their budget. And that's, along with the meltdown of the economy, largely why we and other states, I think, are facing major budget crises.
Well, thank you, Governor. And one of the reasons we titled today's hearing that way, knowing you'd be here, is I happen to be from California. And we, too, in our state, under Republicans and Democratic governors, have been increasing debt while claiming to have balanced the budget. And, I'm an old businessman like Governor Shumlin. If your assets aren't per se going up and your liabilities are going up, you don't claim you're in balance. And that is a problem that I've seen in many states, and particularly my own. Governor Shumlin, you mentioned one thing in your opening statement that was very interesting to me. You said a defined benefits plan is more efficient. I'd be interested to see what efficiency do you get by having a plan which promises something in the future that no one can be sure of. Actuarials try, but obviously they often fail because you see these large adjustments. What is efficient about that versus knowing that an amount of money is going into a fund and that amount of money will be invested fairly and, in fact, will be available as it yields? Which one is more efficient from a standpoint of predictability? And I'm not talking about 401ks or individual. I'm saying, for example, unions trade unions in my state. If you're an electrical contractor, you can't control a contractor that hires you today versus tomorrow. So you're actually, even though you try to be defined benefits, you're a defined contribution plan because you only get in the year in which you're employed as an electrical contractor from that company that's employing. You only get that much money, and the next year you can't control, you can't claw back the way your employees can claw back. So why did you say that it was efficient? The efficiency question kind of lost me.
Well, it's efficient for two reasons. The first is it gives the employee a guaranteed retirement plan. And I think there's been tremendous misunderstanding of that around the country, which is that in Vermont, as an example, our average pension, and that's—
I understand why it's more desirable for the recipient.
Right.
Here in the Federal Government, we have a defined benefits plan.
Right. The efficiency from my perspective as Governor is simply that the returns for our investment, not taking a picture of it during the worst recession, but over time, and unlike General Motors or, you don't go bankrupt, states don't go bankrupt, they never have, and I believe bankruptcy has been greatly exaggerated.
Well, it's not within the Constitution that gives you a choice.
Therefore, we're held to a slightly different standard than a General Motors retirement plan. The point being, the average return for us has been around 8.5%, and it gives us the ability to efficiently deliver a predictable, defined benefit for an employee who is often working for less than you would get paid for their lifetime.
Okay. I think I've got your answer. I'd like to get Governor Walker. Along that line, why is that more efficient than knowing the amount that you give in a given year under the budget is the amount? And even if you invest it and you try to make the same returns, ultimately the state knows that the next year they're going to give a similar percentage. Why is, and like I say, the Federal Government has defined benefits, but why is that more efficient versus perhaps making sure that you budget without these ups and downs that come when the yield doesn't occur?
Well, I think when you look at benefits, be they in the public or the private sector, defined contribution is ultimately more efficient. That's not what I'm advocating. In our case, just like you mentioned with the Federal Government, just like Vermont, we have a defined benefit as well, particularly for retirement with the pension. Although I think it's important to know what we're asking for is not changing the benefit itself. We're asking for people, again, myself included, to pay more as a contribution for the cost of that. Mr. Quigley talked about, Representative Quigley talked about in his opening statements about the State of Illinois. I think that's an important distinction. In Illinois, earlier this year, Governor Quinn and the legislature raised taxes on individuals and on businesses in an attempt, a supposed attempt to balance their budget. Yet today, they have a pension system that's half funded. We went the opposite way. We lowered the tax burden on job creators. We made it easier to do business in the state. We showed that Wisconsin is open for business, and we have a pension, excuse me, a pension system that's essentially fully funded. That's important because you get to the heart of this. That's why Illinois is in that category of California and others, because they've failed to make the tough decisions to get their finances under control, and that's going to affect their economy.
Thank you, Governor. And as I recognize the ranking member, I just want to make one thing clear for the record. The Federal Government currently, for regular Federal workers, 28% of what goes into our health care benefits are paid for by the Federal worker. In the case of the Post Office, it has historically been 20%, but one of the major unions has renegotiated it to 25%. That's what's happening here centrally in Washington. I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The thing that I think stands out here is the fact that, and I say this to both governors, that sometimes we may lose sight of, and that is that just like the postal workers, we had them before us a few days ago, they were able to shed 100,000 employees out of 700,000 in 3 years. And one of the things that they said is that they are Americans too, and they don't mind sacrificing. And speaking of sacrificing, Governor Walker, when I listened to your testimony, you made it sound as if you have made very reasonable offers to the unions, but that they have been unreasonable by rejecting your offers. For example, you asked employees to contribute 5.8% for pension and 12.6% for health insurance premiums. And you went on to say that most workers outside of government would love our proposal. You talked about your brother. And like many other workers in our state, he would love a deal like the one I offered the government workers. The thing that I did not hear, though, was that the unions agreed to double their share of the health insurance premiums and to increase their contributions to the pension system. That's not true? Well, what did they do? They didn't. Yeah, I want to hear what you have to say, because I'm reading an article from your local paper, and I'm just wondering what.
I'll answer the question, Representative. Two of the statewide union leaders made a statement a week into the debate about suggesting that they thought they could accept that. In the weeks that followed, up until the bill was signed into law, nearly every local union that settled a contract settled it without a pension or a health care contribution. To me, actions speak louder than words. Those two statewide leaders could not speak for the unions in nearly 1,000 municipalities, 424 school districts, and 72 counties. They're the ones who decide at the local level, and up until the bill was signed into law, they were not following the actions of their leaders. To me, actions spoke louder than words. The other key difference here is we got into this trouble, and I acknowledge both parties in our state. Republicans and Democrats drove us into this by failing to make tough decisions. If we have a short-term fix, we just push the problem off to the future. What we give are permanent, long-term solutions, the tools that state and local governments need. They can only get it if you make those sorts of changes. And in terms of workplace protections, Wisconsin has the strongest civil service protections in the country. That was passed more than a century ago. Those remain even with this new law in place. That protects grievances, that protects civil service protections in both hiring and firing decisions. All those protections remain even after these changes, Mr. Cummings.
I'm looking at an article from the Wisconsin Journal Sentinel, and I guess that's a local paper.
One of them.
And in this article, Democrat State Senator John Erpenbach makes crystal clear that all its state and local public employees, including teachers, have agreed to the financial aspects of your proposal. and all they were asking for is that you strip them, that you not strip them of their collective bargaining rights. That's not accurate?
Again, that was the statement made by the statewide leaders. The actions they took after those statements, though, contradict those statements. They did not, if they agreed to the 5 and the 12, you would have seen in Janesville and La Crosse and all the other communities that settled contracts, that they would have put their money where their mouth is and actually did that. That did not happen until after the bill was signed into law. So I think you are right about the story. It accurately explains what was proposed at the time, but in terms of what they actually did, their actions did not represent, or their actions did not coincide with the statements of their statewide union leaders.
Did you ever consider dropping your collective bargaining demands? Did you ever consider that?
For us, to me, having been, I was a county elected official for 8 years. We talked about shared sacrifice because my county faced a crisis. I gave over those 8 years $370,000 of my personal salary back. I made a personal sacrifice, just like I'm going to pay for more for pension and more for health care as governor of the state of Wisconsin. During that time, I repeatedly met with my unions and asked them to make modest changes in pension and health care contributions. In fact, one year, I even asked them to consider a couple of 35-hour work weeks in order to avoid massive layoffs. And every time, the response I got from AFSCME was, go ahead, lay 400 or 500 people off, we don't care. To me, that's why when I talk about protecting the middle class, I'm not just talking about middle-class taxpayers outside of government. Those middle-class workers that would have been laid off are people I represent as well, just like I do in the state of Wisconsin. If I have to choose between massive layoffs or making these sorts of reforms, I'd much rather stand on the side of protecting those middle-class jobs and protecting middle-class taxpayers. Because remember, the vast majority of people in the middle class in my state and across the country have been paying the bill for the expanse of government year after year after year. And to me, those are the people I'm standing up to protect. And you'll never hear me speak an ill word throughout this entire debate. No matter what others may say out there, I have never said an ill word of any of the decent public servants who work, the 300,000 decent people in my state who work for both state and local government. I have great respect for them. I just know that in this together, we've got to make changes to make sure their jobs are protected into the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. The Chair now recognizes the Chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. McHenry, for his round of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Governor Walker, I certainly appreciate your testimony. Governor Shumlin, thank you so much as well. There's this discussion of tough choices. Now, when we're looking at what the government does, right, there are services that municipalities and states render to their people as a matter of collection of their tax revenue, whether it's local governments providing police and protection through the police, or making sure that if somebody's house is on fire, you have a fireman show up. So there are tough choices between the services that the government provides and the obligations it has. So, Governor Walker, can you discuss this challenge for a governor who walks into a very tough budget situation? The challenge between, do you continue to provide these services people expect, taxpayers expect, or do you continue providing a benefit for a select few? Meaning, you have a pension obligation, you have health care benefits and these types of things. The people that are getting the benefit are largely not paying to receive. And then you have the taxpayers who are footing the bill for them. Can you discuss that challenge?
Sure. Again, I'll tell you, not only as a governor for the last couple of months, but as a county official for 8 years prior to that, for us, we saw the distinction. We saw the challenge when, under the environment before we passed this bill into law, for local governments in particular, we were forced with the sacrifice like I faced, or the problem we faced, where when we had a tough budget time, and we had it long before 2008 because of the pension scandal I inherited back in 2002. So we were dealing this ahead of the curve even before the economic meltdown. When we tried to make, as I mentioned before, I think some very reasonable changes when it came to what us as government employees paid for things like pension and health care, or even some other adjustments temporarily as part of the work week, we did that for two reasons. One, to try and protect as many jobs as possible. And two, in turn, because those jobs provide services, to try and protect core services for the people we serve. That's essentially the impetus for me when I looked at the budget crisis we were facing going into the next 2-year cycle of $3.6 billion. I knew we had to make a fundamental change if we weren't going to go down the path that many other governors across the country are, Democrat and Republican alike, where they're cutting billions of dollars from schools, from university systems, from local governments and other areas that affect all the things you mentioned. And instead they're saying, okay, there are the cuts. Now you either make it up through massive layoffs or you make it up through massive property tax increases. I said in my state, I can't afford to have anybody, be they in the public or the private sector, any more massive layoffs. I need more people working. We're changing the business climate. We're showing, in fact, many of the issues Republican and Democrats alike we brought together to pass legislation that made us one of the most proactive pro-job agendas in the country. We had to do all that. We want to protect jobs. By the same token, we know one of the other things that would cut down that recovery would be a massive tax increase. We saw it 2 years ago when my predecessor raised taxes on corporations and on individuals. We saw the jobs leave. We saw the exodus. We want those people to come back.
And I understand competitiveness, especially in the Midwest, in terms of job creation, and so there's competition on tax rates, obviously, right?
Absolutely. We love the fact that while our corporate tax rate is 7.9%, the effective tax rate in Illinois is now 9.5%.
Well,
we love that distinction because we want more people to come up to Wisconsin.
Well, thank you. And the other question I have is, so, you know, as opposed to a private sector pension, where those that are receiving the pension benefit are the ones that are affected by the changes. They're the only ones really affected. The difference with that and public sector pensions is that we as taxpayers have to foot that bill. So it's not simply a lie perpetrated to the beneficiary of or the recipient of the pension, saying perhaps too rosy a scenario on return on investment or underfunding these pensions and so on and so forth. It's also a lie to those taxpayers that have to foot the bill for those underfunded pensions or less than funded pensions. So my question to you, Governor Walker, is do you believe that there is sufficient transparency and disclosure with public sector pensions today?
Well, I think at both the state and the local level as well, there needs to be more transparency. One of the things we're the most proud about this budget is not only that we balanced the $3.6 billion deficit, but the fact that 2 years ago we had the largest structural deficit in state history. In my budget I presented at the beginning of March to the state legislature, we reduced the structural deficit by more than $2 billion, a 90% reduction. It's where Moody's pointed out that they called it credit positive. When's the last time you heard anything called credit positive related to a government budget? They call it credit positive because we finally took control of what we should have been doing for years and weren't from both political parties. That is incredibly positive. But the more people know about it, right now, you know, actuaries and a lot of others pay attention to pensions and retirement systems. All of us should be, because that's just deferring. In many cases, it's been about deferring the problem to the next generation. We can't do that anymore.
Thank you. And I know my time has expired, but certainly those that are arguing now about public sector pensions, you have those that are saying that these pensions are underfunded and it's bad. Those are the optimists. Those that look at the pension system and say this is a calamity are the other side of the coin. No one is saying that public sector pensions are too well funded or even sufficiently funded. So thank you for your...
And the one thing important to remember, I mentioned the Illinois-Wisconsin distinction. Not only are they half funded, but you have the Speaker of the General Assembly, a Democrat, a longtime union ally, spoke a month ago about the possibility of reducing the pension benefit itself. That's what happens when you don't take these issues seriously. That's not a Republican or Democrat issue. This is someone who's been a stalwart defender of unions, is now talking about in Illinois the prospect of reducing the benefit. That, to me, would be unacceptable. We made a promise to our public servants about what the retirement benefits were going to be. We should protect that no matter what party we're in. We just got to fix it on the way in.
Thank you, Governor. We now recognize the former chairman of the full committee, Mr. Towns, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Governor Walker, why does people in general, you know, I've talked to people from your state, people just around the nation, feel that your focus is on helping the corporations and basically the wealthy at the expense of the middle class and the poor? Why would they have that perception of you?
Well, it would be erroneous. Maybe it's because they're watching some of the TV ads that groups from Washington played in the state of Wisconsin. Because what we've done in the first 2 months almost, Democrats voted for many of the measures we pushed through that create a better business environment in our state. Even the tax cuts we put in place were things like removing the state tax on health savings accounts, which isn't about corporations. It's about small businesses. It's about family farmers. It's about sole proprietorships. The incentives we put in for job creation were targeted specifically for jobs. So it's ultimately about the workers when a job is created and there's an incentive to do that. The other things we did in our legislative package were all things that were about making it easier to do business in the state of Wisconsin. And in our budget, the things that we're doing are about protecting jobs and protecting the middle class.
When you say make it easy, what do you mean by that? Giving tax breaks to the big business?
No, we don't give tax breaks to big business. What we do is something that's targeted for small business and big alike. We have a specific job tax credit, and if you create a job, there's a tax incentive in there, but it's tied specifically to job creation. So that the person who benefits the most is the recipient of that job. If there's not a job there, they don't get a tax break.
Right. What's the unemployment rate in Wisconsin?
We have a 7.4% unemployment rate, still too high, obviously less than the national average. First 2 months of this year, we've had about 13,000 jobs created in the private sector, about 8,200 new jobs in manufacturing, and next week we'll put out our new job numbers, and I think we're going to be well on the right path.
Did you have to lay off workers, municipal workers or government employees in order to put your budget in place and to get the 13,000 that was increased? I mean, I'm trying to get the real balance.
Yeah, no, you're right. Because in our case, in putting this budget together, we actually avoided it. For the remainder of fiscal year 11, the deficit for the budget put together by my predecessor, Jim Doyle, we had to make up about $137 million. We knew to set the stage for the $3.6 billion deficit we had to balance for the next 2-year budget, we had to do a series of things. We made some other changes, some other reforms. So what we're talking about here today was one part of it. It saves about $1.7 billion over the next 2 years for both state and local government. But for state government, the impact through the final couple months through June 30th, which is the end of our fiscal year, was a $30 million savings. By getting that savings, we avoid having to lay off approximately 1,500 state workers. So we avoided layoffs that way.
You ever think about using maple syrup?
I've got some now. It's pretty good. It's not as good as the cranberry juice we make in Wisconsin, but it's pretty good, right?
Rather than using the vinegar?
Well, I've tried. As a county executive, I tried for 8 years. And the unions basically told me they're layoff people. And to me, that's just unacceptable. If you're truly for the workers, to me, in this economy, the last thing I want to do is see people laid off. And this was a much, much better approach.
Governor Schumer, how did you get people to have a different attitude? I just don't quite understand why people in Wisconsin, would think that way. I mean, when, Wisconsin is just like a lot of other states in this nation, Governor. But anyway, Governor Schumer.
Well, thank you, Congressman Towns. And, I'm sitting here listening to Governor Walker, and I'm sitting here realizing we all have similar challenges as governors. Unlike Congress, we've all got to balance our budgets. So the real question is, what are we arguing about? And my point is, if you want to go after collective bargaining, which I believe helped build this country, helped build the middle class that's been under assault in this recession, just come out and say it. I'm going to go after collective bargaining. But if you want to balance your budget, you bring people in, you talk to them, you have a dialogue. I can guarantee you this. What Vermonters are looking for and what they expect is the same thing that they expect in Wisconsin and the same thing they wish for and expect in America. They want reasonableness. They want compromise. They want bright people working together to solve problems. And when you use vinegar, when you refuse to meet with unions, when you don't sit down and talk with them, when you take on an outright assault on a basic principle in a democratic society, which is collective bargaining, the thing that my grandfather, when he got off the boat, and others now rely on and relied on to make a decent living, to come from a beet farmer to success in America, the thing that built our country, well, that's a different debate. So I think really what we're talking about, because I sit and listen to Governor Walker talk about how he's approaching his challenges, all we governors are doing the same things here, folks. The question is, are you going to bring people together to solve problems, or are you going to go after an assault on a basic principle in America, which is collective bargaining? I think we're trying to do two different things. If you want to go after collective bargaining, just come out and say it. Hey, we're taking you on. But don't try and blame the worst recession in American history on the need to go after public pensions. I'm listening to the question over here. Let's be honest about this. Taxpayers have always paid for a part of public pension retirement plans. This isn't something new, folks. This started with pensions, with asking public employees to give up economic opportunities that they might have if they did what I did and went in the public sector and built a business and made a lot of money. In exchange for getting a lower wage, in exchange for less economic opportunity, they get a guaranteed $25,000, $22,000 on average retirement once they're all done. Now, it's not new news that taxpayers pay a portion of that and that employees pay the other portion. What's new is that in my state, in Governor Walker's state, we're asking the employees to pay more than they did before.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Let me just say this, Mr. Chairman, in closing. Governor, keep using maple syrup.
We're going to try.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Governor Shumlin, I'd like to talk to you, if I could, about the pension plan in your state. I come from Utah. We have, I think, two things that have served us well. One is, in our state constitution, we have a balanced budget amendment. That has forced the issue to actually balance budgets. Number two, we have a defined contribution plan as opposed to a defined benefit plan. And consequently, our state has one of the lowest tax rates. Its business is thriving. And we have hundreds of millions of dollars in our rainy day fund. Now, I went back and looked at the Pew study on Vermont. You're actually doing better than most states, funded at about 92%. But explain to me, you had made a comment to the chairman here about the predictability of the pension program, and I want to talk about the health of that program, because I can't imagine that a defined contribution plan is not superior than to a defined benefit plan, because how do you account for that?
Well, all I can tell you is that it's served my and other states well that have used defined benefit plans, and that we have had over time.
But the health over the course of time. If somebody told me they thought they were going to get an 8 to 8.5% return, I'd say they're probably smoking those maple leaves. I can't imagine that you're getting 8 to 8.5% return on that investment. Nobody's getting that kind of return right now.
If you look at the averages for state pensions across the history of defined benefit plans, you'll find that we get about an 8% return on average. And obviously, there are good years and bad years. But unlike General Motors, since we're not going bankrupt, you got to look at the averages, and that's what we've gotten. That's why Wall Street, when you go down.
But do you think you're going to get that
going
forward?
May I just finish, Congressman?
Yeah, but going forward, do you think you're going to get that?
We do, and that's why Moody's and the other bonding agencies allow us to assume that rate of return on our investments. We're not sort of making this up as governors. That's what Wall Street requires us to do. It's based on history. The second point that I think is really important: if you're a governor, you got to deal with the real world, and the real world is, if you were to move from a defined benefit to a defined contribution plan, hypothetically, it would cost you a ton of money in the first 10 to 15 years, for the reason that the current employees help to support the pension obligations of the states in a defined benefit plan. If you pull the new ones out, you immediately have a higher upfront cost than you would otherwise, because you've got to support your existing defined benefit as you move to a defined contribution. So there's a lot of reasons why we governors are not thrilled at the idea, and you're hearing this from Republicans and Democrats, this notion that, if you just move to a defined contribution, all our problems are going to be solved, isn't in the real world for us governors.
Would the gentleman yield very quickly?
Yes.
Governor, if you're fully funded, that's not true. If you're fully funded, you'd be able to stop putting money in the moment you make the switch, because if you're fully funded, your 8.5% would pay out all your benefits. So you can't have it both ways.
We're adequately funded.
Well, okay, as long as we understand it, adequately is kicking the can down the road. So the studies show that if you only got the rate of return of the Treasury, you'd run out in 2023 with the current situation. You depend on a high return that you cannot bank on in your own statement. I yield back.
If I can just finish, if I can answer that, Mr. Chair.
It's a gentleman.
Sure.
It's a gentleman time. I'm sure I'll let you.
Go ahead.
If I can answer that, we don't make this stuff up as governors. Both Governor Walker and I traveled down to Wall Street to try to convince them that we're running sound economic states, that our bond rating depends on our economic future. We manage our retirement funds based upon the expectations of Wall Street. Now, Vermont's obviously doing that right, since we have a AAA bond rating. One reason is that we use the actuarial projections that Wall Street gives us, which are higher than a Treasury return. And I'm just telling you that if you really study this issue, you'll find that Vermont's not doing anything radical here. We're doing what Wall Street expects us to do, and it is a higher return than the yield you would get on a Treasury yield, much higher.
Governor and Chairman, as I conclude here, I don't want to go over my time. I really do think that a flashing red light for investors, for this country, for the Congress, because we fully anticipate that states will try to be running back to the Congress to get, we can't even fund ourselves. We can't even manage our books here. I don't want the states to ever think they come into the Federal Government to get a bailout. I think states that have not made that difficult choice and made the difficult transition to a defined contribution plan are putting themselves in peril and in great risk. That is our experience in Utah. We made that difficult choice. It is on a more sound trajectory, and I think you will find that states who did make that effort and make that transition will be much more sound financially. That's my perspective of it, but I think it's going to be one of the big issues moving forward, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the former mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, Dennis Kucinich, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor Walker, you said the union leaders agreed to the financial cuts, but then you blamed the local unions for not following through on these pledges. That's because you refused to drop your demand to strip workers of collective bargaining rights that had nothing to do with the budget, and refused to negotiate and rejected the union's offer. Now, Governor Walker, if the unions in Wisconsin agreed to the financial cuts you sought, I don't understand how this can continue to be characterized as a debate about state budget deficits. This is supposed to be a hearing about state and municipal debt. I don't understand how repealing collective bargaining rights for public workers shows us anything about state debt. Let me ask you about some of the specific provisions in your proposal to strip collective bargaining rights. First, your proposal would require unions to hold annual votes to continue representing their own members. Can you please explain to me and members of this committee how much money this provision saves for your state budget?
That and a number of other provisions we put in, because if you're going to ask, if you're going to put in place a change like that, we wanted to make sure that we protected the workers of our state so that they had a right to know what kind of value they got out of it. It's the same reason we gave workers the right to choose, which is a fundamental American right, the right to choose whether or not they want to be a part of a union and whether or not they want up to $1,000 taken
How
out of
much
the
money
union.
does it save, Governor? Just
that
answer the
particular part
question.
doesn't save any.
Okay,
in
that's
the same,
right.
In the same way that
that's
if you,
the point. It
if you read the
obviously
Federal
has
budget,
no effect whatsoever.
I'll answer your
I'm
question.
reclaiming my time. It obviously had no effect whatsoever on the state budget. I want to ask about another one of your proposals. Under your plan, you would prohibit employees from paying union member dues from their paychecks. How much money would this provision save your state budget?
It would save employees up to $1,000 per year they could use to pay for their pension and their health care contributions.
Governor, it wouldn't save anything. There are minor administrative costs, if any. It's obvious what the real intent is here. And
It's
I'll
to give
back it
workers
up.
a right. It's to give the workers the right to choose.
I'll back it up, Mr. Chairman. Right here from the State of Wisconsin's Legislative Fiscal Bureau, this is a nonpartisan state budget agency, much like the Congressional Budget Office. The Bureau was asked to identify provisions in the Governor's bill that are non-fiscal policy items that have no state fiscal effect. This letter confirms the obvious, that Governor Walker's effort to repeal the rights of state workers is a non-fiscal policy item, no effect on the state budget shortfall. I ask unanimous consent that this letter be included in the record.
Reserving the right, we'll inspect it and plan to include it in the record.
That's unusual. You would reserve the right to object.
The gentleman,
I'm
the
claiming
gentleman
my
will
time.
suspend. Hold the time. We fully expect to include it in the record. Because it's not a publication that is widely distributed, we simply would like to receive it, and as soon as it's been quickly vetted during this hearing, it will be accepted. That's a consistent policy from both sides.
I'd like to respond. In the 14 years that I've been on this committee, I've never had a chairman reserve the right to object to putting an official document in the record that was central to the purpose of this hearing, determining whether or not you stripping collective bargaining rights, Governor, is a financial issue or not. It's not. It's a political issue. That's what I'm proving.
The gentleman is incorrect. Chairman Waxman did it repeatedly. In most cases, just as here, by the end of the hearing, items which were not part of widely distributed documents were accepted. I expect to do the same, and I would work with the gentleman to get it done before the end of the hearing. The gentleman may continue.
Well, I've just made it a matter of public record anyway. The title of this hearing is Choice or Necessity. I think that what we've been able to demonstrate here is that the attack on collective bargaining rights is a choice, not a budget issue. There are budget issues as well that need to be addressed in Wisconsin. For example, according to the National Nurses United in U.S. states facing a budget shortfall, revenues from corporate taxes have declined $2.5 billion in the last year. In Wisconsin, two-thirds of corporations pay no taxes, and the share of state revenue from corporate taxes has fallen by half since 1981. That's published in The Nation by John Nickel. I won't ask to submit it by unanimous consent. And also, in the Real News Network, they have a report here that points out that the budget shortfall of $137 million in Wisconsin could have been covered if the State had just kept going its State legislated estate taxes, which they let expire after 2008. Also points out that if they had gone on to collect the estate taxes from their wealthiest citizens, they could have paid down the debt. Now, I just want to say in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, that we really are here at the center of a great debate over the purpose of government, whether there is such a thing as a public sphere with public servants who perform duties on behalf of the public using resources that belong to the public, or is government going to be auctioned off to the highest bidder, to corporations who privatize and inevitably drive up the cost of government, drive up the cost of services, drive up taxes? That's where this debate is headed nationally. I think that Governor Walker has inadvertently done a public service by exposing the extent to which this mindset of privatizing what is the public sphere, bringing this issue to the forefront. So thank you for being here, both governors.
I guess that's a thank you. The Chair now recognizes the
Thank you,
gentleman
Mr.
from
Chairman.
Oklahoma, Mr. Langford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both governors for taking away your time to be able to be here with us. Governor Shumlin, I want to be able to do a point of clarification. You began your oral statement talking about how you didn't want to balance the budget based on the backs of those great employees, and I do concur. We have some terrific Federal employees as well, but the employees as well by dealing with benefits, and you want to go after the real crucial issues. But then you ended your statement by saying, but in the previous governor's time, they did deal with payment, pensions, retirements, all those things. So while you're not starting your time, you did say, but we have just dealt with that a few months ago. Is that correct?
It's been an ongoing effort. Both the previous governor, the Republican governor, don't forget I was President of the Senate.
Correct.
So I actually helped negotiate with the Speaker, the agreement with the teachers' union.
Right. I was just trying to provide some clarification because you were talking about you didn't want to do that on the backs of workers. At this point, you saw corrections and you saw health care as a major issue, but you just dealt with some of the retirement issues and such recently as well.
I don't mean to suggest that we did not ask our State employees to make sacrifice. We did, and they did.
Correct.
All I'm suggesting is that we did it by bringing them to the table.
Sure.
Reasonable
Okay. So it's just the method on that side and the cooperation that the others had with all the leadership as well. Obviously, it takes two to tango on that one as well as people to be able to come together. Let me ask you a quick question on, do you think the Federal Government should be involved in bailing out States when they have debt issues? Is there a point in time that you say this State is so far in debt and so far out of balance, the Federal Government should step in and bail them out?
That's a question I'm going to leave to you. That's why I never want to run for Congress.
Actually, that's a question I'm asking you because as a governor, you obviously represent the intents of a State.
I'll answer it this way. I don't think you're going to have to. And I think that the case for the bankruptcy of States is greatly exaggerated for political reasons. When I go to Wall Street and I say, hey, as I did a few weeks ago, we're in pretty good shape in Vermont, Wisconsin's in pretty good shape, tell us about some of the states we're really worried about, California, New York, Illinois, and others, and they say, this is Wall Street speaking, the rating agencies, we think that the case is being exploited for political reasons, that there are not states that need to go bankrupt.
Right.
That we're going to see our way through this, and that the case for pension crisis is being overstated by Washington.
Okay. Let me ask the same question, Governor Walker. Do you think the Federal Government should bail out individual States?
No.
Okay. Let me ask a follow-up question with that to both of you as well as we have time, and that is, are there things we're doing as a Federal Government that drives up your costs as a State? What I'm looking for and what my committee has been dealing a lot with are unfunded mandates. Things to say, I'd like to get my budget under control. These things I can manage. These things I cannot because the Federal Government has these set of requirements. Are there things we're doing to cause you more debt and more problems in spending?
I see we've got 2 minutes. There's no way I can answer that question in 2 minutes.
I will allow your staff to submit all you can for the record on that. Yeah.
Number one thing you could give us, block grant Medicaid.
Okay.
You give us a block grant for Medicaid, that is, I had to put $1.2 billion more of general purpose revenue, that's state aid, state funding, into this next budget, even though I had to cut everywhere else. It's the biggest part of my budget growing. It's the biggest challenge out there. We have maintenance of efforts that require us to maintain things by the Federal Government when we have other things that would work better to manage those costs. We need to get to a point, and we've led the country. Places like Gunderson Lutheran have been ahead of the curve when it comes to the idea and concept of medical homes, paying for performance, paying for outcome, not paying for procedure.
Right.
If we had that option, I think any of us, I think Democrat and
Now,
Republican
now you're
would like
aware
to have
that
that flexibility.
Now, you're aware that when I'm also on the Budget Committee, when we brought up that idea, we've been told that the governors will certainly kick people out of nursing homes and they'll be ruthless to their populations, then you can't be trusted with any of these funds.
Well, that argument was made back in the 90s when my good friend Tommy Thompson was governor and he pushed welfare reform. Bill Clinton ultimately embraced that welfare reform, and in the end, states were given block grants. All those same sorts of charges were made back then, and instead, we had some of the most successful welfare reform during that generation. We can do the same thing now.
Governor Shumlin, are there areas that we're doing as a Federal Government that's causing you pain as far as in the financial side?
Yes. And just in terms of Governor Walker's response, we're all concerned about health care costs, Medicaid, Medicare. The only thing I'd caveat with is just a block grant makes me nervous, because as our populations grow older, which is happening in all of our states, as costs and utilization goes up, I don't want it to be an excuse for the Federal Government to get out of its obligation on sharing costs and saying, hey, we're giving you a block grant, you're on your own. If utilization goes up, it's your problem. So how that flexibility gets translated is really important to us. The details matter. Second, another big driver for us is education costs and No Child Left Behind. And there's no question that those mandates are driving education expenses in our public schools, requiring us to teach to a test, and requiring extraordinary paperwork of teachers when they could be teaching.
Okay. Thank you very much. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Braley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Bruce Braley, and I'm proud to be a public employee. In fact, Governor Walker, when you were a 6-year-old growing up in my district in Plainfield, Iowa, I got my first job as a public employee with the Poweshiek County Conservation Board. And I learned how to clean toilets, and I learned how to mop floors and scrape gum off the bottom of school desks. And I also worked out in the blazing sun, building bridges on farm-to-market roads, driving an axe into spikes into creosote-treated lumber. And one day on the job, my left hand caught on fire. So I know a little bit about what public employees do. And you mentioned the TV ads that groups from Washington ran against you, and yet you yourself had a large amount of support from secret donor groups like the ones that attacked me in my campaign. Are you willing to go on the record here today and denounce the influence of outside secret money in political campaign ads?
Again, I thought the purpose of today was to talk about debt and
well, let's talk about
that.
You ran campaign ads on the principle of good government, and I thought that's what we were here to talk about today. In fact, you ran a campaign ad called Real Leadership. And when the campaign ad ran, it says your focus was bringing people together to solve problems. Do you remember that ad?
Yep. And I would argue, if you want me to, you ask me a question, I'll say I remember it. And that's exactly what I did
you've answered
in
the
my
question.
first month and a half when Democrats and Republicans came together to push economic development.
Excuse me, this is my time, Governor.
Well,
You've
you asked me a
answered my
question.
question. I asked you
if you want to do a
remembered it.
political stunt, go ahead.
I'm not doing a political stunt. I think if Dr. Phil were here, he'd say, how's that working for you? You also ran an ad called Yes, We Can. And you said, working together, we can put government back on the side of the people again. You also ran an ad called Make It Right, talking about government scandal benefiting politicians. You ran all those campaign ads. Well, this is your chance to make it right. Are you ready to apologize to the people of Wisconsin for hiring the 27-year-old son of one of your major campaign donors who's a lobbyist, and that individual had no college education, very little managerial experience, and had 2 drunk driving convictions and was hired for an $81,000 a year job when you obviously had better qualified applicants? Are you ready to make an apology today to the people of Wisconsin? That doesn't sound like good government to me.
The Chair will ask the gentleman to suspend. Please turn off the clock. The Chair would remind all participants, although members here at the dais have a right to speak for 5 minutes and say anything they want, and we will consider it germane, our witnesses are only asked to respond to items which they came here prepared to respond to that are consistent with the subject of the hearing. So it is for the witnesses to decide whether a question is germane. Well, in fact, members here have an almost unlimited right to say what they want to say during their 5 minutes. The gentleman may continue.
When I grew up in Plainfield, at least for the years I lived there, and Chuck Grassley was our state assemblyman back then, there were good, decent people, many of whom were farmers, who recognized, many of whom were deacons at my father's church, who recognized when times were tough, you had to make tough decisions, particularly when times were tough in the finances of the church. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're talking about that. You may not want to talk about that. You may want to talk about anything. And I'll answer your question about the 27-year-old.
I'd be interested in your answer, because that's the question the people of Wisconsin want to hear today.
Well, I'm glad you're interested in the people of Wisconsin.
I am.
Because that person was 5 levels below me. When that position was, when that hiring was brought to my attention, I had my staff go back and have that person taken out of that position, and I acknowledged the fact that there were more qualified people, and I asked someone else to be put into that. So that's the answer to your question.
Well, in fact,
if you look at, again,
I'm reclaiming my time.
Well, if you don't want to hear, if you don't want to hear the truth, then keep it up.
Has written an article about this and noted that 2 of the highly qualified candidates for that administrative post were Oscar Herrera, a former state cabinet secretary under Republican governor, Scott McCollum, who had a doctoral degree and 8 years of experience overseeing the cleanup of petroleum-contaminated sites. The second, Bernice Madison, was a professional engineer who served since 2003 in the post to which Mr. DeShane was appointed and had 25 years of experience in state government. And since the whole focus of this hearing is on good government practices and how that affects the debt that states have, I think it's time that we got some straight answers from the people who are radically reforming state governments, and that's why this is so important. And I would ask the Chairman to hold a hearing, and I've got a letter for the Chairman, since we have broad jurisdiction according to the committee's website, to look into the other factors that are impacting state budgets, including cronyism in state government. And I've got a letter to the Chairman to that effect. I ask unanimous consent for the article from the Dubuque Telegraph-Herald titled "Walker Insults Young Worker with Cronyism," published on April 11th of 2011, to be made a part of the record, and I yield back.
Without objection, the gentleman yields back. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Governors, thank you both for being here. This is very insightful for me, especially in my home state of Florida, but we are also going through some of the similar exercises that you all have gone through. It's interesting because when we look back at the history of collective bargaining, especially with public sector unions, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt and both President John F. Kennedy who did not feel that there should be collective bargaining or there should be public sector unions. So being here today on this issue, I think, shows the evolution of this and why it's such a crucial issue, especially in light of the debt and deficits that each state in this country is facing. The Federal Government in the Office of Personnel Management has published consecutively for years up until 2008, a study of the amount of time that was spent by union employees on official time. The last time this was published was in 2008, and it showed that Federal Government union employees spent 3 million hours of official time to engage in union-related activities. This was a cost to the Federal taxpayers of about $120 million in 2008. Unfortunately, upon repeated requests by several congressmen and the Competitive Enterprises Institute under this President, we have not received a response from that. In your respective states, and I will start with you, Governor Walker, do you keep track of any official business or union business done on official time?
Yeah, I wouldn't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I know both at the state level and we see the same thing at the local level. We certainly saw that when I was the Milwaukee County Executive. And it's an interesting cycle because taxpayers in many cases are paying taxpayers money, which not only goes to workers, but in many cases then goes to government employee unions, who then use that money for political purposes, who then elect candidates who then advocate for more government and higher taxes on the middle class. It's a vicious circle.
So Wisconsin does keep track of official time spent spent on union activities?
There's time, for example, there's time at both the state and the local level that's designated that people who are employees of the government who are designated as union officials have to account for time that's taken, and as part of their contracts. In many cases, we saw at the local level, the county, the number of individuals who are on the payroll who are working for the unions.
Governor Shumlin, is it the same situation in Vermont?
It's not an issue in Vermont. Our public employees, unionized, work hard, and they work long days and long nights, and we are certain that that's what they're doing, and that's what they do with their time. You know, we're a small state where everybody knows what everyone's doing, and in Vermont, we work hard, and our public employees work just as hard as our private sector employees.
In Florida, we're deliberating now in the legislature, and something that was deliberated back when I was in the legislature there, what was known as a Paycheck Protection Act, and it would require that the employees make an affirmative acknowledgment and confirmation that they'll sign over a certain part of their paycheck to union dues instead of it just having taken out regularly. Is that something that has been entertained in either of your states, Governor Walker?
Yeah, that's in the legislation that I signed into law approximately a month ago. And the concept with that is, in the interest of workers, they should have the right to choose. If they want to have that money taken out, if they want to be a part of a union, and if they ultimately want to have the choices on whether or not they give that money to that union or not, they should be the one that chooses that.
Governor Shumlin?
It hasn't been any significant part of the debate. You know, we're really, like Governor Walker, we're facing a tough economy and a tough budget challenge, trying to balance it. And thanks to the largesse of Congress, the last budget deficits for all we governors haven't really had to be dealt with because we got so much money from Washington. That's over, and we got to balance our budgets the old-fashioned way. So we're making tough cuts, tough choices, and I'm doing it by focusing on what matters, which is health care costs, corrections, and other areas where I have explosive growth, and I'm not worrying too much about union dues.
In accomplishing these objectives, whether they be pro-union or anti-union, whatever they may be, requires people to come to the bargaining table. It requires people to come to consensus or compromise. And one of the issues that we saw in Wisconsin was that there were senators on the Democrat side who left the state and failed to come to the table to address. And as a public official, as one who is elected, I take personal offense to somebody who abrogates their responsibility by not owning up to their obligations to make these decisions, as difficult as they may be. And so, Governor Shumlin, I would ask you, do you condone such activities where elected officials leave the state or abrogate their responsibilities to enforce their obligations as an elected official?
Well, I got to tell you, I got my hands filled dealing with the challenges that I'm facing in Vermont, and I don't comment much on what's happening in the other 49 states. I'm just focused on what's happening in Vermont. In Vermont, everyone is working together with lots of maple syrup to get tough things done.
Thank you. Governor Walker?
Yeah, obviously I have great concern. When I talk to factory workers over the last month or two, I point out if you walked off the job for 3 weeks, you wouldn't be working there anymore. I think that's pretty clear out there. So I think there's a real challenge, and obviously the individuals in those 14 Senate districts are going to decide whether or not that makes a difference long term. But you said something else about working together, and I believe in that. But I also believe more important than working together is people want results. And so in the beginning of this year, we worked together with Democrats and Republicans and one independent we have in the legislature. We passed some of the most aggressive job-creating legislation in the country. We showed that Wisconsin was open for business. But sometimes working together is a problem. In the past, Democrats and Republicans worked together, and they pushed the problem off to the future. And at some point, leaders, no matter what party they're in, have to stand up and say, we got to do something about it. And that's what we're doing here.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor Shumlin, I see that seated behind you is Matt Vinci, who is a leader of a public employees union, the firefighters. He's sitting next to his brother from Wisconsin. You're the governor. He's public employee union. Did one of you not get the memo that you're not supposed to get along?
I don't know if I didn't get it, but all I can tell you is we get along great, as you know, and there's nothing better than our firefighters working hard for us and sacrificing their lives for us every single day.
You know, as I've listened to Governor Walker describe his problems, it sounds to me very similar to what you described to me this morning when we had breakfast as to the problems you face in Vermont. I mean, governors cannot escape the consequences of the greatest recession that we've had since the Depression. And that recession is brutal and shows no mercy whether it's a Republican governor-led state or a Democratic governor-led state. You've described your approach, but clearly there are points of real contention that you have to deal with as governor. You've got a legislature that is pushing you, and you're resisting to raise revenues. You've got public employees who, yeah, they did cooperate, but on the other hand, they've got to represent their members and stand up for wages and benefits. Just maybe give a brief summary of how you managed to get from here to there. And then I want to be able to talk to Governor Walker, too, and I don't have that much time. So
I'll try to be very brief. You know, really, as you know, my guess is that my approach isn't much different than other governors across the country. We're trying to create jobs and economic opportunities. As I mentioned, the middle class has been kicked in the teeth over this recession, harder than I think they've been kicked in years, and we're trying to find ways to raise their income. And we do that by going after real savings in health care, by going after the recidivism in our corrections budget. It's costing taxpayers $47,000 a year. We have a very high recidivism rate. And by going where the real money is, while we resist raising taxes so that we can actually grow jobs and economic opportunities. And you heard Governor Walker talk about wishing to import jobs from Illinois, and we're all doing that. I'm hoping to bring in a few jobs from New Hampshire and Massachusetts and New York as we manage our budget, and we're a great place to do business, work, raise a family, the best place in the country, in my judgment.
Okay.
But we do it by getting along and by using common sense and reasonableness.
let me ask Governor Walker, I just want to make an observation. We have a problem here in Congress. And this is my own personal observation about serving for 5 years. There's too much of a winner-take-all attitude, because when I hear my Republican colleagues say we've got to deal with spending, I happen to think they're right. But I also think we have to look at other things, too, like the tax code in revenues. I would say that quite candidly, a lot of disagreement from some of my colleagues. But one of our problems in Congress is a winner-take-all approach where even if you, quote, win, and we see this with the health care debate. The Democrats, quote, won on health care last year, but now the first act of the new Congress is to repeal it. If you win in a way where the other side feels they didn't have a seat at the table or things are crammed down, and both sides can be, doing this, there's a price because you end up winning on the vote, but you don't make progress on the policy. Mm-hmm. And, obviously, your state was the center of the storm with a very hard confrontation between two sides. And I'm asking if you would just observe or comment on your thoughts about whether there is a price that may be paid in your state as a result of the fact that the approach that was taken did result in this enormous confrontation and a lot of controversy and a lot of pain that continues even after your policy, I think, was prevailed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the results obviously were frustrating. One of the things that frustrated them the most is I think if you were going to participate in democracy, you got to be in the arena. And when 14 of my colleagues in the Capitol decided to leave for 3 weeks, it made it pretty difficult to do that. In fact, in particular, one of them, someone we'd worked with before on jobs initiatives, spent a good chunk of that time trying to work with us. And as he revealed in the Wisconsin State Journal a week ago Sunday, he was closer to us than he was to his other colleagues. My hope is that people like him and others will continue to come to the table and work on our jobs agenda, the things we need to continue to do. I think we'll be on the right track. But again, I go back to what I said before. People want us to work together, but they want that because they want results. When I look at what Mitch Daniels did 6 years ago in Indiana, essentially for the state, he did what we're proposing or what we proposed in this legislation to do. His numbers were far below mine. In that first year, or first 6 months he was in office. He was dealing with some of the same passions, just not as big because he did it through an executive order, not through a piece of legislation. But 4 years later, he's reelected with 58% of the vote because in the end, people saw the results. All the fears didn't materialize, and the results proved that in that state, the government got better, it got more efficient, it got more effective, and ultimately, good public employees in Indiana were rewarded.
Okay. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And both governors, thank you for being here. I come from the private sector, so I understand a little bit about having your own skin in the game and being able to sign the front half of a check. I know that sometimes down here we lose perspective about whose money it is we're spending. And I got to tell you, when somebody else is picking up the tab, it's easy to keep saying, go ahead and keep on partying. Now, I want to ask you this specifically, because the Chairman started off with a discussion, also Mr. Shevitz, about defined benefits and pensions. And I know in Pennsylvania, that while all of us took a hit when the stock market went down with our pensions and we lost quite a bit of it, at the end of the day, that was a loss. If you can, in both your states, tell me about who makes up the loss for the benefit that is calculated out there. And I really think defined benefits is a complete illusion. It gives us the belief that somehow the future is both predictable and reliable, and we all know it isn't. So please tell me the deficiency, the difference between what the defined benefit is based on what the actuaries are saying and the actuality of it. Who makes up the difference for that?
You know, I think it's really important to stick with the facts. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at Vermont, this is what happened. In the worst stock market crash in a long time, we watched it go from roughly 12,000 to 6,000 a Dow. The average person in a defined contribution plan sold their stocks when they got discouraged somewhere between 8,000 and 6,000. Those who were in defined benefit plans had people like Vermont advising them to hold on and hold out, and that's what we did. So now our retirement plans are higher than they were in the depths of the loss. The average small investor now has lost what they saved for retirement. So again, it's a great example where a defined benefit plan protects workers more ably than a defined contribution plan, and Vermont's example is exactly a proof of that theory.
Okay, but my question is, who makes up the difference in a loss?
My point is there was no loss. We've gotten the gains back.
I understand what you're saying, but there is somebody who does provide the safety net, and we both know that. Governor Walker.
Yeah, it's taxpayers. In our case, before these reforms, you've talked a lot today about, for example, my proposal of the 5.8% contribution. One of the things I want to make clear, because it's different than Vermont and other states, before this reform, other than literally a handful of state employees, the taxpayers were picking up both the employee contribution and the employer. So I'm not upping the employee contribution. I'm actually having the employees of the state, including me, actually pay the employee contribution. Again, something that's done on the private sector, as you know, the employer pays part, the employer pays the other part. And what I found when I was traveling the state in the midst of this debate, particularly when I go to manufacturing plants, and guys, point out they're paying 25 to 50% of their health insurance premiums. Most of them, if they have a retirement plan, it wasn't a pension, it was a 401k. And many of them, to keep people working, were suspending the employer match just to be able to keep people from being laid off. That's the reality of it. And then when I would walk them through what I was asking, because they'd see the ads and they'd think, hey, wait a minute, you're taking all this money away. Just as an example, in the basic family plan that my family has, we'll go up to pay about $200 a month in premiums versus about $90 a month.
Right.
Again, most people in the private sector, middle-class taxpayers, wonder, wow, that's unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, and I've got to tell you, and I think that's the important thing to understand. If I have a defined benefit, then I can go ahead and stick with that plan because come hell or high water, I'm still going to get my defined benefit. But when you're in a person whose real money, their money's in the program, and you have a choice to opt out now and try to keep what you have or lose it, then you're really put in a box. And I think most people in this country don't understand. Now, my daughter is a teacher. My wife is a teacher. I've got a lot of friends whose benefits are guaranteed. And they're guaranteed by people in the private sector who will see a raise in their taxes to cover the loss in these pensions. And I think that's where the divide comes. This is not about union workers versus non-union workers, Republicans versus Democrats. This is about Americans. And if we are going to share the gains and we're going to also participate in the pain, we better understand that when you have your own money in the game, it's a vast difference between somebody who is guaranteed a benefit regardless of what they put in. And that's the important thing. Taxpayers make up the difference in all these losses. That's the model, and that's what's wrong with it. You don't have the safety net in your private plan, but the public sector does, or the public sector does. And I think that is a vast difference, and I think it makes it a lot easier to stick with a plan that's upside down and say, you know what, I'll go ahead and ride it out because one way or the other, I'm still made whole. Thank you so much for both of you being here. I appreciate it. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Governors. Governor Shumlin, did I understand in your testimony that you said that the pension fund in Vermont has an 8.5% return, annual return?
That's correct. That's what we've had over time. And I think it's really important to address the question of who pays. And the statement just made that taxpayers do. at least in Vermont, maybe we're unique, I don't think so, 80% of the benefits that we pay out are paid for by return on investment.
80%?
That's correct.
So you're a member of the National Governors Association?
Excuse me?
You are a member of the National Governors Association. Is it your understanding from your fellow governors that Vermont is unique and that most state pension funds are in fact underwater or about to go so?
It is not my understanding that most are underwater, no.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record correspondence provided by the National League of Cities, NACO, NASAC, ICMA, NSRA, and a number of other organizations pointing out, as a matter of fact, that most state pension systems are very solvent and have been quite stable for the last half-century.
Have they been received by the parliamentarian yet?
Have they been received by the parliamentarian? All right. We have copies here, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. They'll bring them up. We'll reserve and make a final decision by the end of the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Governor Walker, when you campaigned for governor, did you campaign on the issue of collective bargaining being a problem with respect to Wisconsin's budget?
I talked about wages and benefits overall, even ran campaign ads on it, but I didn't specify exactly what form. I talked about the broad spectrum, and in fact, AFT Wisconsin, one of the unions that objected to being on this, actually ran campaign flyers pointing out some of my statements about collective bargaining, mediation, arbitration, and other issues. So that was an issue that was a part of the campaign.
Explicitly?
Again, I didn't run an ad saying I'm going to do exactly this, but I talked about the full range. In fact, talked about it in a couple of the debates about the fact that the full spectrum of issues.
Good. That's what I had 43 debates when I ran for re-election last year. That's a lot of debates.
I didn't have that many. I'm glad.
Probably more than most members of this body.
That's impressive.
And I enjoyed every one of them.
That's also more than most members.
Exactly. But did collective bargaining, in your debates with your opponent, you actually brought up collective bargaining and said that's something I'm going to address if elected governor?
I talked about the whole spectrum. I talked specifically about the 5 and the 12%. They said, how far are you willing to go? I said, I'm willing to change the law from one end of the spectrum, whether it's a modest change or an outright change. I've talked about it there. I talked about it again in the transition. I talked about it.
Governor Walker, I'm asking a very specific question. Yeah. Did you explicitly single out?
No. I talked about the full range.
It might be, you might concede that some might be surprised then that you made collective bargaining such a centerpiece of your so-called reform efforts after you were sworn in.
No, and I'd say no, because for 8 years as county executive, I not only talked about it, I actually brought it up. I did what was called a reality tour, where I talked about the challenges that we were unsustainable and that collective bargaining was driving that.
So from your point of view, nobody should have been surprised once you were elected and sworn in.
100% correct.
Were you then surprised at the reaction it generated in your state?
Not in my state. For 8 years, I took on the status quo in a county that's never elected a Republican before. I was elected with 54, then 57, then 59%, because I think in times of crisis, people aren't so much concerned about Republican or Democrat. They want leadership, and that's what we took on. That's what we're trying to do at the state level. What did surprise me, candidly, was the level of national attention, the folks that came in from Washington and others to be a part of that debate.
Thank you. Let me ask a quick question. You got a famous phone call from somebody pretending to be David Koch, or Koch, or however one pronounces it. And he said, well, I tell you what, Scott, once you crush these bastards, I'll fly you out to Cali and really show you a good time. You responded to that by saying, all right, that would be outstanding. What did you mean by that? And what did you think he meant?
At that point, I was done on the call. I had 2 other people waiting for me, and I was trying to get off the call and get on to the next issue.
It wasn't that you honestly thought it was Mr. Koch and that he was promising to reward you for what you were doing?
Did not, on that regard, no.
The flying out to Cali thing didn't strike you?
No. I don't even know where Cali is.
Have you ever had a conversation with respect to your actions in Wisconsin in using them to punish members of the opposition party and their donor base?
No.
You've never had such a conversation?
No.
Thank you. My
No,
time is
again,
up.
I've spent 8 years talking about the challenges of the county official, the fact that I had a union or a series of unions in Milwaukee County who constantly told me to lay people off as opposed to making modest changes.
Thank you. My time is up.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. Dr. Desjardins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Governors, for being here today. Governor Walker, I believe your state, my home state of Tennessee, has constitutional requirements to balance the budget. Obviously, that constitutional requirement does not exist in Washington, D.C. Do you believe that these constitutional requirements give you additional support and leverage you need to make the difficult decisions that need to be made to get your fiscal spending under control?
Yes, and I think both of us as governors talk about the fact that as governors, even regardless of party, for us to succeed and to have states that grow the economy, we have to have a balanced budget. Whether there's a constitutional requirement, a legal requirement, or otherwise, I think the states that are going to succeed, regardless of who the governors, are the states that take their fiscal challenges head on.
Okay, thank you. This last election, it was pretty clear to me, coming from the private sector, that the American people have sent a referendum that they feel government overall is too large and it's too intrusive and it's in the way of creating jobs. And so, I take heed to that as we sit in these hearings and we justify a lot of the programs within the Federal Government, whether they're good or not, and we had discussions whether or not private sector versus public sector pay is fair. Governor Walker, how would you gauge the pay and benefits afforded to the public sector workers in Wisconsin? Critics have said that your reforms are hurting a group of workers that are already worse off than their private sector counterparts. Are they wrong?
Well, let me just point out two quick things on that. One, this debate to me has never been about the level of pay or compensation, because I think there are great people who work at the city, the county, our school district, state government. I've said that repeatedly. What this is about is balancing the budget and making sure we can do it long term and giving our state and local governments the tools. Now, there have been plenty of studies, and there are studies all over the map. There are studies that show that whether you have a higher education degree or not, whether it's higher or lower, I think the key is, again, if you look at, when I've toured the state, when I talk to the constituents I have, and I talk to people in the middle class working at our factories and farms and other locations, they realize they're the ones that foot the bill for more and more government. And they think it's realistic that if they're paying on average 20% for health care, they're paying something for their pension or their 401k or whatever they might have, they think it's realistic that the rest of us who work in the government pay something similar to that.
Thank you. Governor Shumlin, you had mentioned in your testimony earlier that you went to where the money was to help get your fiscal house in order, and you mentioned health care. I was wondering if you had some insight that you could share with us to how you went about that, and if you have a solution to the health care crisis and the cost.
Wow. Well, how long do we have? The answer is yes. We are working very hard to pass a health care bill that will be the first in the country where health care is a right and not a privilege, where it follows the individual, is not required by the employer, which we think will be a huge jobs creator, but most importantly, as Governor Walker suggested earlier when he was talking about health care, where we actually reimburse providers based upon keeping people healthy, health care outcomes, instead of the fee-for-service model. And we've put together an ambitious plan. We're passing the Senate almost as we speak. It's already passed the House, so I'm going to sign it into law. And then we're going to come down to Congress and beg you for a few waivers. And so I'm so glad we have this opportunity to start begging now.
Okay. We'll be interested to see how that turns out, because we certainly have our challenges here. Do you believe that collective bargaining is really a basic human right?
I believe it's a basic right in a democratic society. And, you know, I say that as a guy who grew up born and raised in Vermont. My ancestors, like so many of us probably in this room, came to this country with nothing, passed through Ellis Island, ended up picking beets. My great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, out in the Midwest somewhere. And frankly, were it not for the right to collectively bargain, I don't believe that my relatives or most middle-class Americans would have the opportunities for economic progress that they enjoy today.
Okay. You had made a comment outside the National Governors Association meeting that the ability to collectively bargain is a basic human right in democracy. Now, this is in direct contradiction with Franklin Roosevelt, who was a pro-union person, and he said meticulous attention should be paid to the special relations and obligations of public servants to the public itself and to the government. The process of collective bargaining, as usually understood, cannot be transplanted into public service, and he goes on to say, a strike of public employees manifests nothing less than intent on their part to obstruct the operations of government until their demands are satisfied. Can you comment on that?
I just say that even someone as great as Roosevelt could be wrong once.
I might disagree on that point, but my time is out, and I thank you for your comments. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I want to acknowledge my colleague, Mr. Murphy from Connecticut.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and both Governors, thank you for your attendance today and for sticking with us throughout this process. I guess I just have a simple statement and question for you, Governor Walker. I guess for those of us that have been watching this debate play out, and I think this has been covered by several of my colleagues, it's hard to square the concessions that have been made by the unions, their willingness to come to the table, and the continued drive to strip them of collective bargaining rights. And obviously, there's been a lot of conversation around the country as to how this plays into a much broader debate that's happening around the nation. And when we look at the amounts of outside money that's been spent in Wisconsin, both with respect to your election, to the fight over the legislation, and then most recently in the last few weeks with respect to this election for the court. It's hard to make the argument that this debate only plays out in the context of Wisconsin's budget fight. And in fact, some of the key players in this drama seem to be pretty open about how this is ultimately about trying to kill a pretty important constituency for working families. Now, I think we had this quote on the board earlier when Mr. Connolly was asking his questions, but let me read it aloud. The State Senate leader, Scott Fitzgerald, said recently during an interview on Fox News, he said, quote, "If we win this battle, and the money is not there under the auspices of the unions, certainly what you're going to find is President Obama is going to have a much more difficult time getting elected and winning the state of Wisconsin." And in a email solicitation or in a fundraising letter, excuse me, that he sent out, he was making the pitch that Republicans should be supported because they faced down big labor's bully tactics and a Democratic walkout in the state Senate to break the power of unions in Wisconsin once and for all. This sounds a lot like a much broader political fight to try to defeat your opponents, to try to defeat the advocates for working families. And I guess I'm sure you have a good answer to this question, but I'd like to know if you agree with the statements of your State Senate leader, Scott Fitzgerald, and how you address the concern of many of ours that the reason that you have $2.1 million being spent on behalf of your candidate for the court, the reason that you have groups like the Koch brothers pouring in thousands and thousands of dollars, because this is about a much broader effort, and it seems that some of the key players in the fight, certainly in the state legislative level, are very open about how this is a much broader assault on unions and the allies of unions. And I guess I specifically want to know if you disagree with that very specific statement made by the Senate leader.
Two things. One, I think any outside observer of politics in our state would probably jump to that conclusion for all the parties involved. They'd look at the $4 million the unions pumped in during the debate and the TV ads that went on. They'd look at the money you referenced and others and say, outside of Wisconsin, there's a lot of people who are viewing this in a larger context.
Except this fight wasn't started by labor.
Well,
this fight was started by—
Did you just ask about the money? And I fairly recognize that. I want to put in context that there's a lot of money all the way around coming from all sorts of sources, and I think a lot of whom are looking at multiple reasons for this. I can't answer for Scott Fitzgerald. I can't for others. I can answer for Scott Walker. And I can tell you, for me, it's about, certainly in part about the budget, but it's also ultimately about making government work better. And I think protecting, when I talk about the middle class, it's not just the paying middle class, it's even middle class individuals who work for state and local government. Because for us, we ultimately believe, and we've seen the alternative, which we're protecting middle class jobs by avoiding what many other states are doing with massive layoffs at both the state and the local level, and by ultimately putting in place a system where the government's going to work better, where, particularly for schools. I've got 2 kids in a public school. I care very deeply about it. I'd like to have a system like we do elsewhere in society where we pay for performance, not just reward based on seniority. I'd like to have people based on merit and performance. This measure, these reforms, empower us to keep our best teachers in the schools, to keep our best city and county and state workers in place, and that's part of the package as well.
My time's almost up, but I understand you can't speak for him, but you can certainly opine as to whether you agree with your state Senate leader when he says that this is ultimately about trying to defeat President Obama in Wisconsin. Do you agree with that?
I can tell you what it is for me. It's not about that. It's ultimately about balancing the budget now and in the future, not just in the temporary, because we've had too many people temporarily trying to push our problems off to the future. This is a long-term answer, and it's about long-term reform in our government so our schools, our local governments, and our states operate better. That's what it is for me.
There are millions of dollars being pumped into the state who disagree with that vision, but I appreciate your answer. Thank you very much.
I thank my colleague. I want to acknowledge my colleague, Mr. Gowdy from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor Shumlin, I noted the conciliatory tone in both your introduction and your opening statement. I made a couple of notes. You mentioned the Unity Tour, which I found inspiring. You said, come to the table. You mentioned the word reasonableness and openness. And on 4 different occasions, you said, come together. My question to you is, how do you do that when the side with whom you disagree has absconded from the state and is essentially a fugitive from responsibility? What table do you sit at when you're not in the same state?
Well, you know, you don't apply the reasonableness plea in the heat of the crisis. You avert the crisis. And I'll just tell you, by way of our experience, under the Republican Governor Jim Douglas, we needed to get roughly $25 million out of our pensions for teachers to balance our budget. And things weren't going so well in those negotiations with the governor. So the Democratic Senate President, myself, and the Democratic Speaker sat down with the union and said, listen, we're going to have to get these savings, and we can do it with you, or we can do it without you, and really we would like to do it with you. And they turned to us and said, we want to do it with you. So my point is, when you're going to work together, when you're going to do what the American people want most desperately from their politicians, and God knows they want it from Washington right now, and so do I, reasonableness, compromise, common sense, you got to start with that foot. You can't ask for it once you've created a crisis.
But there is a concept of mutuality that is inherent or required for that to happen. I know you would agree with me. I also want to say inherent in your comments to me, and in your testimony, frankly, is civility.
Right.
In the last 2 weeks alone, members of this body have been told by a colleague to go to hell, not purgatory, not Sheol, not Hades, not the river Styx, but hell. We have been told that we want to kill women. And my colleague from Virginia just made a reference to a surreptitious phone call that was placed to an elected official. Will you help me and join me in decrying the rhetoric and the tactics that I just laid out?
You know, I think that civility has to be applied to all public officials. And I think that we need to raise the bar collectively. And it applies to Washington, it applies to state governments. Across this country,
Do you think making surreptitious phone calls, pretending to be someone you are not, enhances civility and discourse in this country?
All I can say is I have no disagreement with you that the civility tunnel runs both ways, and we all have a responsibility as public servants, and the American people expect it for us to be civil all the time.
You, in response to Dr. Desjardins, I think, and again, I always allow for the possibility somebody may have been misquoted, collective bargain, the ability to collectively bargain is a basic human right in democracy. What is your authority for that statement? What is your constitutional authority for saying that?
Well, free speech, for starters.
Beyond your ability to say it, where would you point me in the Constitution for support for the underlying notion?
You know, it is my belief as a governor of a state that collective bargaining is a right and something that has served this country with extraordinary progress and distinction. And it's allowed, as I mentioned, families like mine who came from nothing to succeed economically in the best democracy, in the best economy, in the best business climate that anyone could ever design. So all I can say is I see it as a basic right.
Are there
that
exceptions?
We are allowed to organize.
Are there exceptions?
Not that I can think of.
Law enforcement.
I think law enforcement should be able to collectively bargain just like anybody else. And they have in our state, and it's had great results.
In my state of South Carolina, we laid off prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and teachers. We furloughed them for 5 days last year because we have a fiscal crisis like almost every other state. Is that something that you would entertain in your state? Could you ever see furloughing the core functions of government, which all three of those categories are? Could you ever see that happening?
We actually did move our courts from a 5-day week to a 4-day week. I would not furlough.
Your federal courts or state? Because the federal judges have always been on a 4-day week.
We've noticed our state judges. State judges.
I see my time is up. Thank you.
I thank the member. I acknowledge my colleague, Mr. Tierney from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Governors, for being here today. Governor Shumlin, let me just ask you, when you were trying to resolve your fiscal problems in the state, did you start off with the unions by telling them that you were going to require them to hold annual votes to continue representing the government employees, that you were going to no longer deduct union dues from the employee's paycheck, and then expect them to come to the table and start a really good, solid conversation with you? Is that the way you began your conversation?
No, Congressman Tierney, that's not what I led with.
Okay. I just think that's a point worth making. But let me also ask you, what percentage of your annual state government spending is the contributions to your pension accounts?
It's about 4%. And, I think it's important that we remember that. When I talk about the real challenge as a governor having to balance a budget, my health care costs are going up at double digits. My corrections budget has doubled. My challenge is not pensions. Of course, it is a consideration. But our pension funds are now performing quite well, and we're doing okay.
And Governor Walker, what percentage of your state spending is related to the pensions account?
If you look overall, and I don't have the exact percentage off my top of my head, but
Well, then let me ask you this.
but I can give you the numbers, what they are, and you can figure out the
I'd prefer you
percentage.
give me the percentage, but if you don't know that, is it significantly more or less than the 4% that
Well, the total budget for the next biennium is about $600 billion, $60 billion. The total amount of savings that we have from the reforms we put in is 1.4 for
You
this.
don't choose to answer the question. Look, the National Association of State Retirement Administrators says that less than 3% of all state and local government spending is generally used to fund public pension funds. Governor Shumlin, you're at 4%, so you think that's generally roughly right?
That's correct.
Governor Walker, do you want to make an opinion one way or the other?
Again,
or
I
take a pass on it because you're just.
I can follow up and give you the percentage
I would
based on
appreciate
the
it if you
numbers.
would do that. Thank you. We talked just a second, we could, Governor Shumlin, about the defined benefit versus the defined contribution on that. From your earlier conversation, my understanding is that you recognize that when you switch from the defined benefit to the defined contribution, there's a tremendous shift in the risk to the beneficiary. Am I right?
Risk and cost.
Right. And they both go more heavily onto the shoulders of the employee, correct?
And the taxpayers for the short term.
All right. And basically, generally, in your state, I think in others, that when this original situation was set up, that was part of the bargaining process, that the employee may have taken less in pay or some other area they were negotiating on in return for having a little more security in retirement. Am I right?
That's the promise that was made.
Okay. And so it was the employer making that deal as well as the employee.
That's correct.
It seems like a fair deal to you? Fair thing to negotiate on that? All right. Let me ask both of you, if I could, on that. Do either of you ask for the authority for bankruptcy for your respective states?
No.
Governor Shumlin?
No.
Okay. Do either of you believe that a bankruptcy court is better able to overcome political differences than the political process in your state, the governors and legislature?
No.
No.
Okay. Do either of you think that the bankruptcy court is better able to restore fiscal stability in your respective states?
No.
No.
Okay. And do either of you think that the bankruptcy court would be a better manager of your state's finances?
No.
No.
Okay. So you both agree with the letter, the term of the letter that Governors Gregoire, who is a Democrat from Washington, and Governor Heinemann, who is a Republican from Nebraska, sent to congressional leaders that essentially made that point. I said their letter said that allowing states to declare bankruptcy is not an authority that any state leader has asked for, nor would they likely use it. States are sovereign entities in which the public trust is granted to its elected leaders. The reported bankruptcy proposals suggest that a bankruptcy court is better able to overcome political differences, restore fiscal stability, and manage the finances of a state. These assertions are false and serve only to threaten the fabric of state and local finance. Would each of you gentlemen be pretty much in agreement with that comment?
That's the NGA's position, and I support it.
Governor Walker?
I agree.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield? Thank you.
Chair allows.
Let's go back to you, Governor Shumlin. You know, as I listened to, you were talking about the maple syrup and whatever and your methodology. There was one word that you left out. And the reason why I think you got the cooperation that you got is because of respect. The workers felt that you respected them. I heard your story, and I wouldn't be here either if it were not from unions. No doubt about it. My parents were former sharecroppers. Manning, South Carolina, came to Baltimore, got a union job, and that's why I'm here today. So I just wanted to know, and they felt respected.
I appreciate your comment, and obviously respect for our firefighters, for our police officers, for the folks that risk their lives every day, for the folks plowing the roads, and all of our public employees is incredibly important to any chief executive.
The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gowdy. I'm sorry, the gentleman from Arizona, Dr. Gosar.
Thank you. I want to get back to our original topic here about state and municipal debt. We're not talking apples to apples in your states. I mean, let me get this right. You actually are a tax giver to the Federal Government, and you're a tax taker from the Federal Government, if I'm not mistaken, right? For every dollar of tax, you get only 82 cents back, and Vermont gets $1.12 back, right?
You know, I'm an expert on the cheese in our states, not the apples.
Okay.
But,
well, apples and cheese go along with wine and maple syrup.
That's true.
But there's a difference. So there's my link here is I'm coming back to the basic core problem with all states is the Federal mandate and things that some of the states should be doing, right? Particularly, Governor Shumlin, you talk about health care and corrections. Isn't that a 10th Amendment right? Wouldn't you like, don't you like the ability to have some flexibility in regards to those oversight of those funds?
Well, yes, frankly, but you need to define what we mean by flexibility, because my fear is, as we have this, and
well, part of, I think
could,
you're going there.
If I can just finish what I was saying, as we get a little bit towards the next budget discussion, is that flexibility means we're going to leave the requirements and take the money on behalf of the Federal Government, and the states are going to be in tougher shape than we're in already with under reimbursements from Medicaid and Medicare.
Well, and I understand, because with the unfunded mandate, there is this hidden cost that no one wants to talk about, and that is for that Federal law to be enacted in a state, we hire more workers that are not on the private sector, they're on the public sector. And therefore, these roles continually go up. And so part of this is based upon, or the majority of if I look across the board, coming from Arizona, and holy cow, we'll get to those numbers here in a second. But the problem is the budget problems in each of the states are derived by the unfunded mandate by the Federal Government.
You know, I think that's an oversimplification. I think the budget challenges in the states are derived from the worst recession in American history that was brought on by a lot of greed on Wall Street and a housing bubble that got transferred to Main Street. That was the culprit.
Oh, I got to stop you there, because didn't we also have a problem with the Federal Government in that? Didn't the Federal Government establish itself in the risk pool and all the aspects of risk, telling the regulators and telling the banks and telling the financiers, you'll do this? So there's equal blame to go around, and that's not where we want to go about.
All right, but I would actually argue that if we want to get into that it was the lack of regulation of Wall Street that led us to the crisis.
And that's government. Once again, government problems. and coming from the Federal Government. But what I'm trying to get back to is it's not an oversimplification, because when we're telling you a rule, if it is intrinsic to the Federal Government's mission, do you think they ought to pass a buck to you, or they should fully fund it?
I think the Federal Government should keep its promises to the States.
And are you prepared to honor those promises to communities?
Absolutely.
Okay? So when we're talking about health care and corrections, I'm kind of having a problem here on where this unfunded mandate is coming from, because we constantly are kicking the can down the wall, or down the road, and these are the core principal problems that you brought up, is health care and corrections.
Well, you know, it isn't the mandates, and we don't have Federal mandates standing in our way of corrections that are really a budget challenge. On health care, we—
Whoa, wait a minute. Whoa. You know, I've got a famous sheriff out in my neck of the woods that the Federal Government's breathing down his neck and telling him, yes, you can do that, no, you can't do that. So there is some oversight in regards to the Federal Government that dictates exactly how you can incarcerate a prisoner, or how you have to go through a process, does it not?
I don't see it as a cost driver in my State budget.
How about you? How do you feel, Governor Walker?
Well, there's no doubt that not only the mandates on the from the Federal Government to the State Government, but many times the mandates that then go on to the local governments are driven largely by the mandates that start here. And to the extent that we get more freedom and flexibility, and one thing the Governor said earlier, I would concur with as well, is I'd love to have a block grant. I want to make sure that that doesn't mean that that's just, say, here, have it, now we're going to cut it in half either. I realize that we've got, there's a core group of people on things that related to Medicaid, but I do believe if you put the power back in the hands of the people at the State level, States are better equipped to tackle those challenges. And in turn, one State versus another State is going to have very different needs and very different outcomes. And the more that we can adjust to that and not have a one-size-fits-all, the better off we're going to be.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from New York, Mrs. Maloney. Oh, she's returned. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Ms. Maloney, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you both for your participation here today. I don't know that I would have done this if I were the two of you, but I'm glad that you have. Let me start off with Governor Walker. I have here a website, www.standwithwalker.com, that is supported by the Americans for Prosperity, and it is, of course, funded by the Koch brothers. And in it, they say the following: when public sector workers gain sweetheart contracts filled with plush benefits unheard of in the private sector, the taxpayer loses every time. Do you agree with that statement?
I haven't seen that statement before, but I know, as one of your colleagues asked me earlier, who pays, for example, for the pensions and things of that nature? It's the taxpayers. So I don't know about that statement in particular, but conceptually, who pays for the pension and health care benefits? It's taxpayers, including public sector employees who are taxpayers as well.
Well, these are quick facts about Wisconsin's budget repair legislation. The second point is respecting the public trust. When teachers choose not to teach purely to pad their already lavish contracts, do you believe that statement, that they have lavish contracts?
Lavish contracts? No. Again, you weren't here earlier, but I was asked about that as well, and I pointed out, to me, this is not about, I forget which of your colleagues, one of the doctors asked, whether I thought public employees were paid too little or too much or too little, and I said, that's not what this is about. This is about trying to balance the budget and provide long-term reforms that make government work better.
Let me ask you this. Excuse me for reclaiming my time. Do you think the teachers in Wisconsin are paid adequately?
If we could set up a system where we rewarded based on performance and merit, I'd even be willing to pay more.
Well,
but we don't have that system right now. We have one solely based on seniority.
Do you know what the starting teacher salary is in Wisconsin?
Starting, it depends on the district. I know, for example, in the Milwaukee Public School System, the total compensation package for an average employee is about $101,000.
Well, the starting teacher salary in Wisconsin is $25,222, and Wisconsin ranks 49th in the nation in terms of starting salaries for teachers.
And the reason for that is because that talks about starting salaries, not total benefit packages. So, for example, if you're in a school district like many where they don't pay anything for health care, that's an added benefit in terms of what the costs are.
You're 49th in the nation in what you pay your school teachers. Now, let's talk about contributions. How much have you received in contributions from the Koch brothers?
From the Koch brothers? None directly that I know of. There are probably other groups that have supported us, but I don't know what the total is.
Well, I'm under the impression you received $43,000 from the Koch brothers during your gubernatorial campaign.
Could be. I had 50,000 contributors. I couldn't tell you who all they are.
Did you take the phone calls of all those 50,000 contributors when you were in the middle of that crisis?
I talk to a whole lot of people every day.
All right. Let's move on to Governor Shumlin. I was really impressed by one of the statements, many of the statements you made, but one in particular in which you said that Wall Street really believes that this crisis creation is really, relative to the states and their potential bankruptcy, is really a figment of the imaginations of some who are politically motivated to create that kind of angst. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Sure. And I want to be careful, because if I misspoke, I want to be careful here. I hope I didn't say it was a figment of imagination.
No, it was my term.
Okay. What they said was, and in meeting with the rating agencies that I just went through, and governors do that, we go down and make sure that our bond ratings are strong and that they know how we're managing our budgets. And what they said in 2 of the 3 rating agencies is, when I asked about this question, that they feel like the doom and gloom about pensions of the states is greatly exaggerated for political reasons, that they don't think any states are going bankrupt, that they don't think it's the state's biggest challenges, and that they're puzzled by the current perceived crisis.
Now, in much of our discussion today about defined contribution, what is missing is the fact that the taxpayers have to pay 50% of that pension benefit every single month regardless. And in a defined benefit plan, as you pointed out, 80% of the cost is actually borne by the growth that the investments receive. The taxpayers then end up only paying about 20%. Is that not correct?
That is correct. And another point that's important to remember is that, which I mentioned earlier, but I want to make sure it's emphasized, that in this financial crisis, we have asked our public employees, our unionized employees, to pay more. Both our teachers and state employees have agreed to pay more, to increase the share that they're paying. And somehow that's getting lost between the trees here. The fact of the matter is, yes, you're correct, 80% of payments come from investments in the fund. And second, we have asked our employees, and they've agreed to pay more than they were paying pre-crisis. So we are balancing this crisis to some degree on their backs.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and I thank Governor Walker and Governor Shumlin for being here. I'm up next. It was. I accept that. No, we're not closing, and I'm just allowing the chairman a vote opportunity in Judiciary Committee, as I was voting and chairing a subcommittee that was dealing with a non-controversial issue, and I apologize for not being here. Davis-Bacon was what we were talking about, and so I had to be there. But I did read your testimonies and appreciate you being here, and so I did want to ask some questions. Governor Walker, I also appreciate the fact of what you build in Milwaukee and enjoy riding my Road King. I understand you ride as well, and I've enjoyed riding both Wisconsin and in the beautiful state of Vermont. And there are days I wish they were there right now. As a former state official in the state legislature, I'm very familiar with your situation, Governor Walker. When I started my tenure back in 1982, we had a $1.8 billion budget deficit. The process of a number of years, we enacted 26 tax cuts, regulatory reform, a number of things that went to, ultimately, when I left in 1999, we had a budget surplus, a rainy day fund of over $1 billion. Hasn't history repeatedly proven that lowering taxes encourages economic growth and ultimately increases revenue for the states?
Yes, we've seen that in the past, and we saw the opposite of that 2 years ago when my predecessor in the legislature moved to pass a budget repair bill in 24 hours that raised taxes by about $1 billion, and we saw obviously higher unemployment and job loss after that. So clearly raising taxes in the economic crisis is not the right answer, and the more you put money back in the hands of job creators, I believe the better off you're going to be.
Build the economy.
Absolutely.
Well, right now, Michigan, as you know, and in talking with our new governor, we're at a $5.7 billion budget shortfall. Governor Snyder is taking some aggressive steps and being pushed back as well as you've experienced, including dealing with an emergency manager authority over municipalities. And that leads to my question. What do you think of that type of authority, and what are some other reforms that may need to be pursued in order to strengthen the fiscal standing of states like your own?
Well, I'd have to look specifically at what Rick's proposing there in terms of oversight over local governments. I will tell you, though, this goes to the heart, as a former county official, of what I'm talking about and why we pushed reforms that weren't just about the momentary. They weren't just about fixing things today or even over the next 2 years, but about providing long-term relief. And let me be clear, because I think sometimes people confuse this into thinking this has an impact on private sector unions. It doesn't. Collective bargaining is fully intact for any of the private sector unions out there. This legislation that we signed, the law, doesn't have an impact on that for the public sector. To be able to make changes that ensure stability, financial stability in governments at the state and the local level, we had to make these changes. And even more so to make sure that government can continue to be reformed and where we can improve the system and ultimately reward good employees. That also was a part of this package as well. So in totality, I believe we give local governments the kind of long-term tools they need, not only to balance their budgets, but to make prudent decisions so they can protect core services.
Okay. I appreciate that. Well, I was going to ask both governors, but let me continue my questioning here at this point. What steps can Governor Walker or should not, I guess the positive and the negative, what steps can or should not Congress do to help you in your budget situation? And I guess following up with that, do you agree that another state bailout is not the solution?
Well, to me, asking the taxpayers, me as a federal taxpayer, which obviously reminded of this week, asking me to bail out another state isn't something I'm particularly interested in as a taxpayer. To me, I think each of us in each of the 50 states have to make, in many cases, the tough decisions to ensure that we not only balance our current budgets, but we make long-term decisions. And if we look to other people at the federal level or other entities to do that, I think that puts us in a very precarious position. One other thing, if I might digress for just 1 second from your question, the gentleman from Massachusetts, and I apologize, I think his nameplate is turned, but asked me a question about process. And one thing that's just important to put in the record, we didn't start the debate the way that's been characterized. In December, after the elections, but before I was sworn into office, the public sector unions in the state rushed to the lame duck session of the legislature and to the governor and tried to pass through contracts that would have locked us into a more dire financial situation with costs that I believe we couldn't account for with a $3.6 billion deficit on the horizon. So that was the initial act. Now, we were successful in appealing even to some of the Democrats in the legislature to stop that from happening and giving us a chance to do that. But when people ask, why didn't we begin by negotiating, it was really the tone was set early on by the process that was taken after the election, but before we were sworn in. And that's why it became clear to us that we needed to empower both our state and our local government to make those sorts of long-term changes.
I thank the Governor. And now turn to Ms. Mahoney, and I thank you for putting up with the confusion that went on there.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your very thoughtful questions. And welcome, Governor. Thank you for your testimony and for being with us here today. Governor Walker, many unions and some elected officials, including some Republican governors, have criticized your actions as extreme, referring to them as some sort of fringe effort to attack workers' rights and dismantle unions. And how do you respond to these criticisms? Do you feel your actions were extreme or out of the mainstream in any way?
No, because I believe fundamentally if what we've heard said over and over again was a fundamental right, you all in Congress would be acting on it right now. You do not have collective bargaining other than Postal Service workers for the vast majority of public employees who work for the Federal Government for wages and for benefits. If it's a fundamental right, why aren't you debating it right here now? It's not. It's a government entitlement. Collective bargaining is important for the private sector. For the examples we've heard about the impact it's had on families and legacies, private sector unions are my partner in economic development. I work with them, and I hope to work with our public employees.
Okay.
But collective bargaining itself is not a fundamental right. Rights come from the Constitution, and nowhere in the Constitution does that clearly define that.
Well, many of the criticism does come from unions, but I have a stack of editorials here from major papers across the country, and I'd like to go through some of the headlines. We have the Chicago Sun-Times, and its editorial says, "Cut pensions, but don't bust unions." We have the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it says, "A bridge too far." The Los Angeles Times says, and I quote, "Wrong in Wisconsin." And the Boston Globe, its headline says, "By overreaching, Wisconsin governor hinders reforms in all states." I even have some editorials from your own state's papers, the Milwaukee, Wisconsin Journal, the Centennial, and the Green Bay Press Gazette. I would like to read from a few of these and get your response. The Philadelphia Inquirer calls your actions, and I quote, "a partisan plot masquerading as fiscal prudence," end quote. The New York Times says, and I quote, "Even when unions have made concessions, Republican officials have kept up the attack. The Republicans claim to be acting on behalf of taxpayers, and this is not believable." The LA Times says your claim, and I quote, "that public employee unions must be crushed in order to balance the state's budget is deeply disingenuous." And the Milwaukee, Wisconsin Journal Centennial writes, and I quote, "that unions have conceded on benefits, but parts of Walker's budget repair bill unfairly targets collective bargaining for public employees." Even the Green Bay Press Gazette, a newspaper that I believe endorsed you when you ran for governor, says your approach, and I quote, "casts the debate as an anti-union campaign and not a tough but fair shared sacrifice." So what is your reaction to these statements by respected papers across our country?
Sure. Thank you for your question. I'd point out two things. One, just a factual error that a couple of those papers alluded to, and I mentioned before, the unions did not reach settlements. Two public employee unions made a statement, neither of which was codified in any agreement, and none of which were
But Governor, this was not referring to those specifics.
No, I'll answer your other part about that.
But may I finish, because my time is expiring? I believe the point that they made in these editorials is the same point that many of us on this panel have been trying to make today. And we're trying to make the point that it's one thing to ask for a shared sacrifice for financial reasons, but it's very unfair, and you appear to be trying to strip American workers of their rights, and there does not seem to be any financial rationale at all. That's what these editorials are making.
Sure.
Instead, it appears very much to me and to others to be ideologically and politically motivated.
Per your original question, I'd say many of those same voices said the same thing about Mitch Daniels in 2005. After his time in office, after people saw the benefits of the collective bargaining reforms he put in place, where government got more efficient, more effective, more accountable, and where ultimately public employees who were doing a great job got rewarded. The people in his state reelected him with 58% of the vote. I think it's because they recognized results. They wanted results, and that's what they got.
I thank the gentlelady. We now recognize the former chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Burton, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, may I put these editorials in the
Without
record?
objection, so ordered. Additionally, the earlier unanimous consent for Mr. Connolly is accepted, so his will also be placed in the record.
Well, Governor, you can't run out on me now. I was going to say something nice about you.
Congressman Burton, he's going to be right back, and we just
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 2-minute recess.
Okay. I was going to say something nice. That shows you the influence I have. Scared him away. I see Governor Walker has returned, and so we'll resume. The chairman will return shortly. I did this for 6 years, so I might be able to work my way through this till he gets back. First of all, Governor Walker, I really appreciate you mentioning Mitch Daniels. He's my governor, and we think he's done one hell of a job. And we're proud that you think so as well. And he did a lot of the things that you have tried to do in Wisconsin by executive order. And as you said very clearly, the state is in good fiscal condition. He's done an outstanding job, and we're very proud of him. And that's why he got reelected by such a large majority. So, and he won reelection at a time that, for the first time since 1964, we lost the state to the Democrat candidate, Mr. Obama, for president. So it shows you, against the tide, he did very well. I'd like to ask you, Governor Shumlin, you don't have a balanced budget requirement in your state.
No, we do not.
Yeah. And you're going to adopt a single-payer system for health care?
We're trying, yes.
And how are you going to pay for that?
Well, our challenge in health care reform across the country, and both Federal and State, in my judgment, has been that no one has gotten cost containment right. So our first challenge is to design a system where we are using our dollars more efficiently and ensuring that we're spending less on health care. We're going to pay for it once we figure out how to get cost containment right, and that's a real challenge, as you know. We are then going to figure out the best publicly financed method to pay for it, and that decision will be made in 2013.
Are you familiar with the situation in Tennessee with their plan or the situation in Massachusetts with their plan?
I'm not clear what you're alluding to.
Well, I mean, they went to a program that's not exactly like yours, but similar. The government was going to control the health care and the expenditures and that sort of thing.
Well, I can tell you that I don't study Massachusetts and other states as much as I study Vermont, and frankly, we've already done that. We have Dr. Dinosaurs, which covers all our children. The Republican governor, Jim Douglas, passed Catamount, which covers you up to 300% of poverty with a great benefits package. We have VHAP, Vermont Health Access. So no one has better access, I don't believe, with the exception of maybe Massachusetts, than the State of Vermont. So my challenge is that we've done access. We now have a cost problem. They're doubling every 10 years. It's driving businesses and middle-class Americans who are paying more and more money for less and less insurance. We think we can get it right in Vermont.
Without raising taxes?
Well, the point is we're raising taxes right now because health care premiums are going up so quickly. The tax being money coming out of Vermonters' pockets at a higher rate than they can earn for rising health care costs. I pay it as a business person when I give my employees health insurance. It's a health care tax. Rising costs are a tax on business and a huge hindrance to job creation.
So you probably will have a tax increase?
No, we won't have a tax increase. What we will do is design a system where we spend less on health care than we're spending now and find a way to pay for it where it follows the individual isn't required by the employer. The tax increase now is coming from the rate at which health care costs are growing about twice of our incomes. So that's what we're trying to fit.
Well, but I understand there's going to be an offset there, but how do you make the offset? I mean, you've got to have the money to offset the rising cost of health care. How are you going to get it?
We're going to reduce the rising cost of health care. We're getting the money right now.
No, I understand that. But if you can't reduce the rising cost, let's say it doesn't work.
If we can't reduce the cost, we won't pass the bill.
You won't pass the bill?
That's right.
So you won't have a tax increase?
Our goal is to pay less for health care and ensure that we are delivering quality health care to all Vermonters without the waste. Where are we going to?
Well, I understand, and you're a very good politician. You're skating the issue. You're not saying you will not raise taxes, but if necessary, you probably would have to.
What I'm saying is that we're paying the tax right now. It's on my business. It's on every business in Vermont. It's every Vermonter
I understand,
paying
Governor.
for premium.
I can see how you got elected, Governor. You're sharp. Let me just say, Governor Walker, I don't see how the local municipalities in your state who are facing rising costs could possibly have survived without huge property tax increases, other tax increases, unless you did what you did. And so I was very happy that you had the perspicacity to hang in there when you had those problems. I'd just like to ask you now, I know this is before the court, your Supreme Court. Do you have any idea when they're going to make a ruling on your case?
Well, appeals been made to the Supreme Court right now. Very well may be likely today. The Circuit Court mentioned yesterday they may even, by today or tomorrow, put forth a ruling on the original issue on the open meetings law. But one way or the other, it probably will end up in the Supreme Court. But it could be as early as this week.
And that will probably be a close vote, I would imagine, on the Supreme Court.
It's hard to tell. I'm not a lawyer, but when I was in the legislature, I had the audacity to actually read the legislation I voted on, so sometimes I was accused of being a lawyer. But I've read the statutes, and in this case, the law is pretty clear. Yeah. And I think in the end, whether it's the Circuit Court, the Court of Appeals, or the Supreme Court, ultimately, the rule in favor of the legislature, and I've said all along, it's not if this will be the law, it's when.
Yeah. They're providing a speed reading course for members of Congress so they can read 2,500 pages in one 24-hour period. So I'm happy that you in Wisconsin was reading the bills. As I understand it, the state and local governments, you asked the employees to contribute 5.8% to their pensions and 12.6% to their health care premiums, and the current private sector employees are paying about 20%. So what you were talking about was substantially less, even though you were having an increase in it, substantially less than what the private sector was paying.
That is correct. Middle-class taxpayers in our state are paying more, and they're also on top of that paying for the government that they'll have to pay for.
Now, do you have, you don't have a, do you have a merit pay system, in Wisconsin?
We have a civil service protection system where we have some benefits for those non-represented employees, but we don't have the same things under those individuals who are represented employees. This would allow us to do that not only at the state level, but ultimately at the local level, which is particularly important in schools, cities, towns, counties, so forth. We could pay for performance, and that would be exceptional.
Very good. Well, I see the boss is back, so I'll turn the chair back to him, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Burton.
The Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
Mr. Chairman.
The ranking member is recognized.
I just ask unanimous consent that Ms. Norton be given seven minutes, as was Mr. Burton. He just took 7 minutes. I just want to make sure we got equal time, that's all.
Absolutely. We have run over on almost every person, but certainly I expect that the next speaker may run over a similar period of time. The gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
Thank you both. I'm very grateful for both of you to come this morning, because you present us with a contrast in approaches of running a state government in hard times, and I certainly want you to know that I recognize that there would be great differences between your two states. Both of you, though, come from states with a history of strong unions and collective bargaining, so in an important way, you're comparable. But of course, there's been quite different results with those unions. You are facing something of a backlash, Governor Walker, and court cases and all the rest of it. I do want you to know that I believe you faced a terribly serious situation. For a new governor to come in and be faced with what you, and for that matter, Governor Schulman, were faced with, is nothing to do anything but take seriously. There's certainly no more funds from the Federal Government, as your predecessor had, and we're not mitigating anything for you out there. Cuts are proceeding here. Now there are warnings that we could face a double dip. I'm telling you, that's what happened in 1937. The history books tell us that President Roosevelt experienced something of a backlash to his spending to get out of the Great Recession. And then in 1937, they called the results the Roosevelt Depression. So I think the states don't even have what we have. I would like to ask you, Governor Walker, have you yet met with your union, top union leaders?
As has been the practice in the past, the head of the Office of State Employee Relations, Greg Gratz, has talked to them about how we move forward from this point.
Wouldn't it be good to see, now that you come out of the worst of the fight, to seek a meeting with them so as to avoid, to mend as much of the breach as you could?
Again, on not only this issue, but on where the employee contracts go forward from this point, that's why Mr. Gratz set up that meeting, and on other issues beyond just the public employee contracts, but with the head of the AFL-CIO, for example, on issues related to unemployment compensation and changes that need to be made in the future or may need to be made. We have an unemployment compensation council. Both he
you are the head of the government.
You're
this
right.
was you had the press conferences. You called the shots. These people are not going away. You would not have to be engaged in negotiation with them or in the details, but a simple meeting would not send a signal to the state that you at least had reached out in hope of better relations in the future.
Well, my better relations at this point have been with the workers of the state. I've reached out and talked to
Many
workers.
of the workers are in fact represented, and unless they believe that their unions have a better relationship. I don't know why in the world they would figure that somehow you could jump over them and have a better relationship, given what has already happened to them, Governor Walker.
Well, again, the common practice in the past is to work through the position that Mr. Gratz has right now.
All right, Mr. Governor Walker, I see that you are just where you were. It's what happened in the past that led to the most serious breach a governor has had with his workers in memory. Let me ask Governor Schuman, have you met with, you have also had hard times in your state, and let me see if the figures I've been given are correct, that the state employees voted to accept a 2-year 3% cut, that the teachers are agreeing to 3 additional years of work before retiring and to contribute a greater percentage of their pay toward their pensions, and pensions are at the root of much of the trouble of the states, that your State Employees Association have voted to increase the pension contribution by 1.3% over the next 5 years. How have you been able to get unions to give up so much and apparently to maintain some kind of relationship with collective bargaining in your state?
Well, Congressman Norton, I think you got to the heart of it right in the beginning of your comments. The first thing that I did as governor, after getting sworn in that very day, was call the Vermont State Employees Association, our state employee union, into the office and tell them that I needed to make $12 million worth of additional cuts, and I wanted their cooperation through hiring freezes and other methods, which are not part of the list of concessions.
Did you threaten them if they didn't?
I absolutely didn't threaten them. I said, we got to work together to solve this problem. And guess what? They stood with us, and we've made the cuts. In fact, we've exceeded the $12 million target that we need to get for this fiscal year. My point is, I have seen both examples. In the last 8 years, we had a Republican governor who never invited the teachers union up to his office, and therefore turned to the Speaker and myself to get the concessions on the $25 million from them. My point is that reasonableness, compromise, common sense, that's what the American people are looking for. But what they are looking for more than anything is for us to all sit around the table together to solve real problems. We've done that in Vermont. I know that other governors are doing it. I think we all will be well served by that approach.
Governor Walker, I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to give you any advice. You know your situation better than any of us. But if I may, Mr. Chairman, use an analogy based on relationships here in the Congress. You're aware that the Congress is considered to be very polarized. Now, the Chairman and I are on very different sides when it comes to matters affecting national policy and affecting even the District of Columbia. But when I've had a disagreement with him, while I have not recruited him to my position, I have always felt that this was somebody I could talk with and that we'd have a civil conversation. I am known to be combative, sir. I represent people who who have a vote in this committee but don't have any vote on the House floor, second per capita in federal income taxes. But I don't say I'll never want to speak to these Republicans who are going to vote for this congressional resolution coming up. And so I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I do want you to know I am in the minority here. And whether I was in the minority or the majority, and even though we vote often party line, we maintain good relationships. Analogizing that to your situation, after you've had a tough fight with a bunch of unions, I would want to take the high road and say, I'm the big guy here. I'm calling you in. This is why I did it. I hope things go better in the future, and be done with it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. We have a vote. I do not want to hold the governors over. So we have 2 people left present who have not spoken. I'm going to ask you to be at or below 5 minutes so that you both can get in, and then we will recess this panel and we'll thank the governors. So, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank both you gentlemen for not only your patience but your very thoughtful responses. I'm concerned that there appears to be a systematic attack on American workers, and part of that attack seemed to be designed to blame them for fiscal challenges facing the states. Governor Shumlin, in your testimony, you attribute state budget shortfalls not to American workers, but to an, I quote, "the greatest economic recession since the Great Depression," end of it. As you stated, our revenues are down and the need for government services is up. Is that an accurate depiction?
Absolutely.
The Washington Post columnist Ezra Klein explained the same point with respect to Wisconsin, indicated whatever fiscal problems Wisconsin is or is not facing at the moment, they're not caused by labor unions. That's also true for New Jersey, for Ohio, and for the other states. There was no sharp rise in collective bargaining in 2006 and 7, no major reforms of the country's labor laws, no dramatic change in how unions organize, and yet the state budgets collapsed. Revenues plummeted, taxes had to go up, and spending had to go down all across the country. Blame the banks, blame global capital flows, blame lax regulation of Wall Street, blame home buyers or home sellers, but don't blame the unions, not for this recession. Governor Walker, how do you respond to that view?
Thank you, Representative, for your question. As I mentioned earlier in my testimony, I think there are a number of reasons that brought at least Wisconsin to a $3.6 billion deficit. One, like Vermont and other states, is the economy, no doubt about it. You mentioned a bunch of different reasons that people have acknowledged were part of the recession. I won't get into the details of that, but tell you that one significant part, without a doubt, is the economy. And that's why we're working so hard to improve that and show that Wisconsin indeed is open for business, so future budgets are easier to tackle. In our state, though, beyond that, and something I've acknowledged is not a partisan issue, it's been Democrats and Republicans alike in the past, have deferred tough decisions. For 16 years, the last 8 biennial budgets, and it goes back before that probably, but for at least 16 years since the state started measuring the structural deficit, state lawmakers and past governors have deferred tough decisions by rating things like the transportation fund or the patient compensation fund in our state, by pushing off school aid payments to the next biennium, by using accounting tricks. And then the last part I just mentioned was 2 years ago, the last budget was balanced with several billion dollars in one-time federal stimulus aid. All those things, which I believe my colleague mentioned as well, all those things collectively added to our problems. What we've tried to identify are possible solutions, and my reforms that we're talking about here today represent a portion of that. About $1.7 billion worth of savings in the next 2 years will come from those, but I've got a $3.6 billion deficit, so there's plenty of other things.
There are those who suggest that you have balanced your budget on the backs of middle-class working families. You've cut funding for public education, low-cost prescription drugs, and in-home health care, and at the same time gave tax breaks to wealthy corporations. How do you justify that position?
Well, I'd say that's just not true. If you look down the line at the budget we proposed, the biggest beneficiaries of our budget are middle-class taxpayers in the state of Wisconsin. The biggest tax relief we provide is an absolute freeze on the property tax levy in the state of Wisconsin in our budget. That affects middle-class taxpayers as much as anybody else out there. In terms of the middle class, I would contend in our state the middle class are the very people who have been paying the largest share of taxes to pay for the expansive government in the past. You look at just the numbers, $3.6 billion. Our reforms saved $1.7 billion. That means the rest of that, nearly $2 billion that has to be balanced, come from a variety of other areas. Some of that has come from a reduction of state aid to local governments, but that's because in turn, unlike other states that are cutting aids to local governments, we're actually giving them the tools to balance their budget without massive cuts in service, without massive layoffs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and time is up.
I thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from Wisconsin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And the Governor and I have a really long history. We're friends. I'm crazy about his kids and his wife, but I'm not going to spend my 5 minutes pretending that we agree on anything. I'm going to start by suggesting to you, Governor, that I just don't believe your $3.6 billion structural deficit. I think that I served on the Finance Committee for many years, and the chairman has asked the right question: state and local government spending cuts, choice or necessity? That $3.6 billion structural deficit, I'm not going to call it a structural deficit, is simply the difference between what the agencies request and your austere budget. So in between there's a lot of debate about whether or not there's a $3.6 billion structural deficit. You know, even when you consider stuff like the Medicaid payment, which was one time only, $169 million, $200 million in that patient's compensation fund that the courts say you got to pay back. But of course, that wasn't even in your budget repair bill. Or the $58 million for the Minnesota Reciprocity Fund, which also was not in your budget reconciliation bill. The Fiscal Bureau for current year fiscal 11, you had $121 million in cash, which is not a lot of money. So you started out by giving $117 million worth of tax breaks, which reduces revenue for the next fiscal year. And in contrast to giving these wealthy people tax breaks, you cut the earned income tax credit, doubling the taxes on the poorest parents by cutting the earned income tax credit. With respect to collective bargaining, you know, you said in your testimony that folks were running and having a fit to settle contracts that they had been working on for a year. All 11 examples that you've given were already, the members were making concessions around health care. Every single one of the 11 people that you raised. You said yourself that the pension fund is 99.67% funded. So the question is choice or necessity. And in terms of public workers making more money than the private sector, that is not true. They make 8.2% less considering their education and training, and that's what pension funds are, deferred compensation. They have bargained for years for less money in order to have a pension, which is deferred compensation. Now, let me ask you, choice or necessity? Did you really have to end Medicaid benefits for dialysis patients or put waiting lists for disabled people who need home health care? What in the world does balancing a budget have to do with your program in Milwaukee to expand education vouchers so that the richest person in Milwaukee County can take $6,500 away from the poorest kids in the state for education? What in the world does that have to do with balancing a budget? You reinstate the 30-hour work week on welfare recipients, and you tax welfare recipients $20 a month to balance the budget. Transportation. I know you would, if there's time, if the chairman is given time, because I'm using my 5 minutes to make my statement. You know, you're going to say you gave $410 million to your favorite fund and your favorite folk you love, to the highway people. $410 million that governors in the past have rated it for education. You took $1 billion out of education, which most governors don't do, but you didn't do it for transit. There are 12 communities in Wisconsin that give 24 million rides a year that are going to suffer because of what you've done. And you know, you're going to lose $46 million in federal funding because you've taken collective bargaining away, and that's against federal law. And so, you know, Governor, I ask the question, if you have time to answer, state and local government spending cuts, choice or necessity? And I yield back the balance of my time.
Would the gentlelady yield for a question?
Yeah, I have 10 seconds left.
Wasn't that 10 seconds? What Federal law requires collective bargaining, and would you lose money over it?
Transportation, there's a transportation prohibition against, we have communities in Wisconsin that provide public transportation, and you have to have public workers' collective bargaining agreements in place in order to get the transit reimbursement.
Excellent. Would the gentlelady be willing to put that in the record,
Yes.
the data supporting it? Thank you.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. And I thank our two governors. Members, left and right, have a lot of unanswered questions, but only because many of us spent too much time not asking the questions, and in some cases we simply ran out of time. So I would ask both the governors if you, with the aid of your staff, would mind answering some supplemental questions from the committee. Let the record show you've answered in the affirmative, which I appreciate. Additionally, at the beginning, we received general leave for you to add additional information that you choose to, perhaps expanding on any answers you gave or providing supplemental information. I thank you again. This has been great for the committee, and I'm sure good for those who took the time to watch or to attend. With that, we stand recessed until about 10 minutes after the last vote.